Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just a quiet place where the noise of the day can settle down for a while. Because tonight we're going somewhere that sounds at first like the opposite of escape. We're going into one of the hardest periods in American life. Not to a battlefield, not to a palace, not to a room where presidents made speeches under bright lights, but into ordinary streets, ordinary kitchens, ordinary movie seats, ordinary living rooms, and the small, stubborn ways people tried to breathe when the world around them felt as if it had stopped making sense. Tonight, we're going back to the United States during the Great Depression, to the 1930s, to a country where millions of people woke up every morning, not quite knowing how they were going to make it through the day. And yet, in the middle of that fear, Americans did something that might sound familiar. They went looking for a way out, not always a real way out, not a train ticket to somewhere better, not a new job waiting around the corner, not a miracle at the bank or a letter from the government saying everything had been fixed. Sometimes the only escape available was a movie ticket, a radio comedy, a dance hall, a baseball game, a cheap magazine, a board game spread out on a kitchen table, or a night spent listening to someone else's voice come through a wooden box in the corner of the room. And here is the thing that makes this story worth telling slowly. Escaping reality during the Great Depression was not the same as ignoring reality. These people were not foolish. They were not pretending that the rent was paid when it was not, or that the pantry was full when it was empty. They knew exactly what was happening. They saw the bread lines. They saw the men selling apples on street corners. They saw neighbours leave town with furniture tied to the back of a car. They saw banks close their doors and never open them again. But human beings cannot stare directly at fear every minute of the day. No one can. So they found places where fear had to wait outside for an hour or two. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late enough that the room has gone quiet? Are you listening from a bed, a couch, a desk, a train, a kitchen after everyone else has gone to sleep? I always like imagining where these stories land, because history can feel very far away until you realise that someone in 1933 also sat in a dark room at night, tired from worrying, trying to hear something comforting through the noise. Different century, different technology, different troubles, but the feeling is not so difficult to recognise. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of the past, it would mean a great deal if you hit the subscribe button and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it, when a detail catches you, when a scene feels real, when you realise that someone long gone was not so different from you after all. And if you want to tell me where you are listening from tonight, drop it in the comments. A city, a small town, a country road, a bedroom with the lights low wherever you are. I genuinely love reading those. Now dim the lights a little if you can. Let the room soften. Let the modern world step back for a moment. And let us go back to an American evening in the early 1930s, when the country was tired in a way that did not disappear after sleep. Picture a street in an American city around 1932. It could be New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Philadelphia, or any of the hundreds of smaller towns that felt the same pressure in their own local way. The sun is going down, and the storefront windows are dark earlier than they used to be. Some businesses have closed for good. Their signs are still up, but the glass is dusty, and there is nothing inside except a few abandoned shelves, and maybe a calendar on the wall from a better year. Men stand near corners with their hands in their coat pockets, not because they are waiting for anyone in particular, but because standing somewhere feels better than going home with no news. The country had entered the Depression after the stock market crash of October 1929, but for most ordinary people, the crash itself was not the whole story. A number printed in a newspaper was not what ruined a family. What ruined a family was the factory cutting hours, then wages, then closing. It was the bank failing and taking savings with it. It was a landlord knocking. It was a farm auction where neighbours stood silently while someone's animals, tools, bed frames and kitchen chairs were sold off piece by piece. By 1933, unemployment in the United States had reached roughly 1 out of every 4 workers. That number is so large that it can become meaningless unless you slow down and put faces on it. 1 out of 4 meant a father at the table with no envelope of wages to bring home. It meant a brother who had left town looking for work and had not written in weeks. It meant a young man who had planned to marry but now could not ask anyone to build a life on nothing. It meant a mother stretching flour, beans, potatoes, coffee, hope and patience further than any of them were meant to go. We often speak about the Great Depression in large images: bread lines, dust storms, soup kitchens, men riding freight trains, Franklin Roosevelt at a microphone. Those images are true, but they can become too clean because they are familiar. The real depression lived in smaller humiliations. It lived in the moment a woman turned a dress inside out to hide the worn side of the fabric. It lived in a child learning not to ask for seconds. It lived in a man shaving carefully in the morning even though he had nowhere to go, because not shaving felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. It lived in the envelopes that arrived with bills no one could pay, and the quiet calculations made before every purchase, even the smallest one. And then, after all that, after a day of looking for work or waiting in line or trying to keep a household steady with less than it needed, night came. That is where our story begins. Because night time during the Depression had a strange quality. It was not the kind of night you find in cheerful nostalgia, with everyone gathered happily around a radio and laughing without care. That happened sometimes, yes. Families did gather, people did laugh. But the laughter came after a day that had given them plenty of reasons not to. It was not simple happiness, it was more like relief. There is a difference between entertainment when life is comfortable and entertainment when life is hard. When life is comfortable, entertainment is a choice among many. You go to the movies because you feel like it. You buy a magazine because you want something to read. You turn on music because the house is quiet. But when life is hard, entertainment becomes something closer to shelter. It does not solve the problem. It does not put money in your pocket. It does not reopen the factory. But for a little while, it changes what the mind is forced to carry. This is why the 1930s produced such a powerful culture of escape. The same decade that gave America unemployment, bank failures, foreclosure, hunger and drought also gave it glittering movie musicals, radio comedians, superhero comic books, swing bands, marathon dances, celebrity gossip, sports heroes, and board games about becoming rich. That contrast can look strange until you understand it from inside the lives of the people who lived it. The darker the street outside, the brighter the theatre marquee looked. The quieter the kitchen table became, the more welcome the radio voice sounded. The more powerless people felt in real life, the more satisfying it became to watch a hero, a detective, a cowboy, a boxer, or a tap dancer move with total confidence through a world where something still worked. Now, I want you to imagine a particular family. We will not make them famous. History has enough famous people. Let them be ordinary. A married couple in 1933, maybe with 2 children, living in a rented apartment in a working-class neighbourhood. The father has not had steady work in months. He gets day labour when he can. Sometimes he comes home with a little money, sometimes with nothing but tired feet. The mother takes in laundry or sewing when there is any to take. She knows which grocer will let her carry a small debt, and which one has stopped extending credit to anyone. The children know not to slam the icebox door because there is hardly anything in it, and the sound makes everyone aware of that fact. Their apartment is not empty, but it has begun to look thinner. A radio sits in the front room if they're lucky enough to have bought one before things got bad, or if a relative passed one along, or if they are still paying it off slowly. Maybe there is a small stack of magazines with worn covers. Maybe yesterday's newspaper is folded on a chair because newspapers were read by more than one person, and often more than once. Maybe there is a deck of cards, a checkerboard, A few toys the children have learned to protect because replacements are not coming. The furniture is not fancy. The rug has worn spots. The curtains have been washed so many times the fabric has softened nearly to weakness. The day has been hard, not dramatic perhaps, just hard in the repeated way that wears people down. The father stood outside a hiring gate before dawn and did not get picked. The mother watered soup to make it stretch. One child needed shoes and everyone pretended not to notice how badly. At supper there was enough food, but not enough to make anyone careless. Then dishes were washed. The street lights came on. A neighbour's baby cried through the wall. Somewhere outside a car passed slowly. And then someone turned on the radio. That simple gesture mattered more than we can easily understand now. Today, sound follows us everywhere. Voices, music, news, advertisements, messages, videos, all waiting in our pockets. In the early 1930s, a radio could transform a room. The family did not have to go anywhere. They did not have to spend money that evening. They did not have to be well dressed. They could sit in their own chairs, in their own tired clothes, and hear an orchestra from New York, a comedy team from Chicago, a president speaking from Washington, a baseball game from a city they might never visit, or a drama that made the walls of their apartment seem less close. And here is what I find moving about that. The radio did not remove them from reality completely. It entered reality with them. It sat there among the unpaid bills, the patched clothing, the chipped cups, and the children leaning against their mother's knees. It did not deny the room. It made the room bearable. The same was true of the movies, though movies required a little more effort and a little money. Even in the Depression, millions of Americans went to the cinema every week. That fact can seem almost impossible at first. Why would people with so little spend any of it on a ticket? But that question assumes that pleasure is the first thing poor people should give up, and human beings have never worked that way. A movie ticket could be cheap, especially at neighbourhood theatres or matinees. For a small price, a person could sit in a heated or cooled room, depending on the season, surrounded by strangers who also wanted to forget their own troubles and watch a world where the floors shone, the gowns shimmered, the jokes landed, the music swelled, and the poor girl might still become a star by the final reel. Think about what that meant in 1933. A woman who had spent the day worrying over rent could watch Ginger Rogers dance across a polished floor in a dress that moved like water. A man who'd been turned away from work could watch James Cagney stride through danger as if fear were something other people felt. A child whose family had cut every expense could see Shirley Temple smile into a camera and somehow make adults believe, briefly, that sweetness was still a force in the world. The movie palace itself was part of the escape. Some theatres were built to look like fantasy interiors, with painted ceilings, grand staircases, velvet seats, golden trim, and lights that made entering feel like crossing into another class of life entirely. For people who could not afford luxury in any other form, the lobby alone was something. This is not a small detail. During the Great Depression, Americans did not only escape into stories, they escaped into spaces, the movie theatre, the dance hall, the baseball stadium, the public park, the World's Fair, the neighbour's kitchen where cards were being played. These places gave people temporary permission to be more than their circumstances. A man out of work was still out of work after the film ended, but while he sat in the dark, he was also part of an audience. He laughed when the audience laughed. He gasped when they gasped. He was not alone with his failure. That mattered. I want to pause here and ask you to sit with that for a moment. When was the last time you used entertainment not because you were bored, but because you were tired in a way you did not know how to explain? Maybe you put on a familiar show after a bad day. Maybe you listened to a podcast because silence felt too heavy. Maybe you watched a video late at night not because it was important, but because it kept you company. That impulse is not new. It is one of the most human things we do. The Americans of the 1930s had fewer devices, fewer choices, and far less control over when and how entertainment arrived. But the need underneath was recognizable. They wanted a pause. They wanted a room inside the mind where the depression was not allowed to sit down. And because this was America, escape itself became a business. Hollywood learned quickly that audiences wanted glamour, music, romance, comedy, and stories of sudden reversal. Radio networks learned that families would gather reliably for serial dramas, variety shows, comedians, and live music. Publishers learned that cheap magazines and comic strips could carry people far from their own streets for a few cents. Toy and game companies sold dreams in cardboard form. Even Monopoly, which became widely popular in the 1930s, offered something strange and revealing. The chance to buy property, collect rent, build houses and bankrupt everyone else at a time when real families were losing homes. There is a sharp irony there, but also a kind of understandable pleasure. In real life, the system felt rigged and frightening. On the board, at least, the rules were visible. Not every form of escape was gentle. Some were odd, even desperate. Dance marathons, for example, became a strange Depression-era spectacle, where couples competed to stay moving for days, weeks, sometimes longer, while paying audiences watch their exhaustion. To us, it can look cruel, and in many ways it was. But for participants, there was often food, shelter, prize money if they lasted, and a reason to keep going. For spectators, there was drama, endurance, and the uneasy thrill of watching people struggle in public while one's own struggle remained private. The Depression blurred the line between entertainment and survival in ways that are not always comfortable to examine. That is part of the honesty this story requires. Escaping reality was not always noble or sweet. Sometimes it was commercial. Sometimes it was manipulative. Sometimes it fed on the suffering it claimed to relieve. A Hollywood studio could sell dreams while paying workers poorly. A radio sponsor could wrap advertisements around comfort. A dance marathon promoter could turn human exhaustion into ticket sales. But that does not erase what these escapes meant to the people who used them. History is rarely clean enough for that. The same movie that made money for a studio could also give a lonely person the first laugh they had felt all week. The same radio program designed to sell soap could give a family a reason to gather in the same room. The same cheap magazine printed for profit could let a young reader imagine a life larger than the block they could not afford to leave. The Great Depression did not create the American desire for escape, but it changed the scale of it. Before the 1930s, Americans had already loved movies, sports, vaudeville, popular music, pulp fiction, amusement parks, and celebrity culture. What the Depression did was sharpen their purpose. Entertainment became not just leisure, but emotional equipment. It helped people manage waiting for work, waiting for relief, waiting for crops, waiting for a bank to reopen, waiting for Roosevelt's next speech, waiting for the country to become itself again. There is a phrase that appears often when people remember the Depression. Making do. It sounds practical, and it was. Making do meant stretching meals, repairing clothes, sharing rooms, taking odd jobs, planting gardens, borrowing, bartering, and doing without. But making do also had an emotional side. People made do with smaller pleasures. They made do with a song instead of a vacation, a radio comedy instead of a night out, a magazine instead of travel, a ball game heard through static instead of a ticket to the stands, a dance in a community hall instead of the life they had imagined for themselves before the crash. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than simple nostalgia. We sometimes look back at Depression entertainment and see only charm. The black and white films, the big band music, the radio voices, the cartoons, the smiling stars. But beneath that charm was pressure. These amusements were not floating above history. They were pressed into shape by it. The tap dancing in those films matters because people's real shoes were wearing out. The radio laughter matters because kitchens were quiet. The comic book hero matters because many fathers felt powerless. The World's Fair, promising tomorrow matters because the present had become so difficult to trust. Let us return to that family in the apartment. The radio is playing now. Maybe it is a comedy program. The father leans back in his chair and closes his eyes, but he is not asleep. The mother keeps her hands busy with mending because sitting still feels wasteful, and there is always something that needs repair. The children are on the floor closer to the radio than they need to be, as if nearness will make the story clearer. The room is still poor. Nothing about the furniture has changed. The cupboard has not filled itself. The landlord has not forgotten. The father will still have to go out again tomorrow and ask for work from someone who may not have any to give. But for the length of that program, the family's attention is shared by something other than worry. That is the centre of this whole story. Attention. The Depression demanded attention constantly. It forced people to think about money, food, work, pride, debt, weather, illness, and the future with a relentlessness that could become unbearable. Escapism gave some of that attention back. Not permanently, not completely, just enough. There is something easy and unfair in saying that people escaped reality because they were weak. I think the opposite is closest to the truth. They escaped reality because they had to return to it. A person who has to face another hard morning needs some kind of evening. A family that has been carrying fear all day needs a sound, a story, a joke, a song, a hero, a game, a lighted screen, something that says the world is larger than this trouble. The trouble may be real, but it is not the only real thing. So tonight, as we move through this world, we are not going to treat Depression-era entertainment as a footnote, as decoration around the serious history of banks and elections and government programs. We are going to take it seriously because the people who needed it took it seriously, even when they laughed at it, even when they called it silly, even when they knew perfectly well that Fred Astaire's polished floors and Busby Berkeley's impossible formations had almost nothing to do with the floors they swept at home. A dream does not have to be realistic to be useful. Sometimes its usefulness lies in the fact that it is not. Outside that apartment, the city is settling into night. Somewhere a theatre marquee is glowing over a sidewalk. Somewhere a boy is reading a pulp magazine under weak light when he should be asleep. Somewhere a couple is walking past a dance hall and deciding whether they can spare the coins to go in. Somewhere, a man who spent the day ashamed of himself is about to sit in a crowd and cheer for a boxer who refuses to fall. Somewhere, a mother is turning up the radio just a little because the children have gone quiet and the program is about to begin. And across the country, in thousands of towns and cities, Americans are doing what people do when history becomes too heavy to carry all at once. They are finding a door, even a small one. They are stepping through it for an hour. The first and brightest of those doors for millions of people stood under a marquee, behind a ticket window, past the smell of popcorn and wool coats and perfume, inside a darkened room where the screen lit up, and the Depression, for a little while, had to stay outside. The first thing you would have noticed was the light. Not the screen yet. Not the faces of the actors. Not the music rising from the speakers, or the smell of warm popcorn drifting through the lobby. Before any of that, before the story even began, there was the light outside. A theatre marquee in the 1930s did not simply announce a movie, it called to people. It reached across a dark street with rows of bulbs and shining letters and told anyone passing by that something was still bright, something was still open, something still wanted them to come inside. And that mattered more than we can easily understand now. In a city or town during the worst years of the Depression, brightness was not just decoration. Brightness meant business had not failed yet. Brightness meant heat in winter, cool air in summer if the theatre was modern enough, music, crowds, movement, the smell of cigarettes and perfume and wool coats damp from weather, the murmur of strangers standing together with the same small hope in mind. The hope was not complicated. They wanted to sit down in the dark and be taken somewhere else. Let us imagine a Saturday evening in 1933. The sidewalks are busy, though not in the prosperous way they might have been a few years earlier. There are people walking slowly because there is nowhere urgent to go. There are men in clean but worn suits, collars frayed a little at the edges if you look closely. There are women with hats carefully reshaped and dresses altered one more time to make them last another season. There are children pressed close to parents, already watching the theatre entrance with the alert seriousness children bring to any promised treat. A line has formed at the ticket window. It is not a wealthy line, not the kind of crowd that can afford ease. It is a line of people who have counted coins before leaving home. That counting mattered. A movie ticket in the early 1930s could vary widely depending on where you lived, what kind of theatre you entered, what time of day it was, and whether you were going to a grand downtown movie palace or a smaller neighbourhood house. Some cheap theatres and matinees could be reached for a dime, sometimes less in earlier houses or special shows, and children could sometimes get in for even less. The phrase nickel dreams captures something true, even when the price was not literally a nickel. It was the idea that for a small coin, for less than the cost of many other pleasures, a person could buy entry into a world that looked nothing like the kitchen table at home. And here is the thing I want you to sit with for a moment. During the Great Depression, the movies did not become less important because people were poor. In many ways, they became more important because people were poor. Weekly movie attendance fell from its late 1920s peak as the Depression deepened, because of course it did. When families were choosing between food, rent, coal, shoes and entertainment, the ticket was not always possible. But even with that decline, tens of millions of Americans continued going to the movies every week. Think about the scale of that. Week after week, in a country where unemployment was enormous and money was tight, people still found their way into theatres. That tells us something. Not that Americans were careless, not that they did not understand hardship, but that a movie was one of the few luxuries still small enough to reach and large enough to matter. The movie theatre had already changed American life before the Depression began. In the early years of film, people had crowded into Nickelodeons, those small storefront theatres that flourished in the first decades of the 20th century. They were often plain, cramped, noisy and cheap, set up in converted shops where a continuous programme of short films could be shown to working-class audiences for a few cents. The Nickelodeon was not refined. It was not trying to make anyone feel like royalty. It was a place where immigrants, factory workers, children, clerks and labourers could sit together and watch moving pictures flicker on a screen, sometimes accompanied by a pianist, sometimes by sound effects, sometimes by the whispers and laughter of the crowd itself. But by the 1920s and into the 1930s, the movie business had learned something powerful. The building could be part of the fantasy. The escape did not have to wait until the film began. It could start at the entrance. This was the age of the Great Movie Palace, those enormous theatres built in cities across the United States, with interiors that borrowed shamelessly and wonderfully from every style that suggested splendour. Egyptian columns, Spanish courtyards, Italian ceilings, French staircases, Chinese dragons, stars painted overhead, chandeliers, velvet, marble, gilding, mirrors, thick carpets, ushers in uniforms, lounges, smoking rooms, powder rooms, and stairways wide enough to make an ordinary person feel that the act of walking up them had become important. Now, if you were wealthy, perhaps such spaces were not shocking. Perhaps you had seen hotels, private clubs, grand restaurants, or homes with marble and gold. But for a working-class family in 1932, a movie palace could be the finest interior they ever entered. That is not an exaggeration. Many people who lived in cramped apartments, boarding houses, farmhouses, or company towns could walk through the doors of a movie palace and suddenly find themselves under a ceiling painted like a night sky. There might be artificial clouds drifting above them. There might be statues in niches. There might be a carpet so soft it changed the sound of their footsteps. For a few minutes, before the film even began, they were not standing in a relief line, not looking for work, not patching shoes. They were guests in a palace. I want to be careful here, because there is a way to talk about this that becomes too sentimental. The movie palace was not a gift. It was a business. Every chandelier, every uniformed usher, every glowing sign, every cooling system, every carefully designed lobby was meant to sell tickets and keep people coming back. Hollywood and theatre owners understood the emotional hunger of the public and profited from it. But the fact that something was commercial does not mean it was empty. A person can know they are being sold a dream and still need the dream. A theatre owner could count the money at the end of the night, and a tired woman in the balcony could still feel, for the first time that week, that the world had widened. Imagine stepping inside on a cold night. Outside, the wind moves along the street and lifts dust near the curb. Maybe there is snow dirtying at the edges of the sidewalk, or rain collecting in the gutters. Inside, there is warmth. The lobby is brighter than any room in your apartment. The brass fixtures have been polished. The posters promise romance, laughter, music, crime, danger, or something with a handsome face looking into the distance, as if the future has personally invited him forward. The ticket in your hand is small. You could lose it easily. But for the next few hours, that little piece of paper means you belong here as much as anyone. The ushers mattered too. This is a detail easy to miss. In many movie palaces, young men and women in neat uniforms guided people to their seats with flashlights. They enforced order, yes, but they also created ceremony. The act of being shown to a seat made the experience feel formal. A person who had been treated all day as unnecessary, unwanted, or invisible could be addressed politely. This was not nothing. In a decade when so many Americans felt their dignity slipping through forces beyond their control, even small gestures of public dignity carried weight. Then came the auditorium itself, a vast room opening before you, larger than many churches, with rows upon rows of seats and a screen waiting at the front like a blank doorway. People removed hats, settled coats, whispered, coughed, unwrapped candy, shifted children onto laps. The crowd was part of the pleasure. We often think of movie watching now as personal, something we do alone or with a few people, pausing when we like, checking a phone, drifting in and out. In the 1930s, a theatre audience was a living body. Hundreds or even thousands of people reacted at once. They laughed together, applauded together, sometimes hissed together, sometimes cried quietly in the same dark. The individual troubles each person carried did not disappear, but they became part of a crowd's larger breathing. Before the main feature, there was often a whole programme. This is another thing modern viewers forget. You did not always go only for one film. You might get a newsreel, a cartoon, a comedy short, a travelogue, a serial instalment, previews, and then the feature. In some theatres, the programme ran continuously, and people entered when they arrived, stayed through the point where they had come in, and left when they felt they had seen the whole thing. That meant the theatre was not simply a scheduled event. It was almost an environment. You could step into it from the street and let it carry you for an afternoon. The newsreel is worth pausing over because it complicates the idea of escape. Before television, newsreels were one of the ways Americans saw moving images of the wider world. They might watch floods, political speeches, foreign leaders, sports victories, parades, disasters, inventions, and ceremonies. During the Depression, newsreels could bring reality right back into the theatre, sometimes in sharp form. There might be images of President Roosevelt, public works projects, unrest overseas, drought or relief efforts. Yet even news became different on the theatre screen. It had music under it, narration over it, an order imposed on it. Reality appeared, but shaped, edited, contained. The world could be alarming, but at least in the newsreel it came in segments and moved on. And then the cartoon might begin. Think about that transition. One moment, the audience sees politics or disaster, and the next there is animation, music, absurdity, a mouse, a sailor, a duck, a character being flattened and restored in ways no human body could survive. Cartoons in the 1930s carried a particular kind of freedom. They obeyed no bank, no landlord, no hiring boss, no drought. Gravity itself was negotiable. A character could be crushed, stretched, tricked, chased, blown up, and still return for the next gag. For children, this was delight. For adults, perhaps, it was also a small release from the heaviness of consequence. But the main feature was the true doorway, and Hollywood learned to build those doorways with extraordinary skill. The early 1930s were part of what we call the golden age of Hollywood, when the major studios controlled production, distribution, and often exhibition through powerful systems that could turn actors into stars and stories into national experiences. MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, RKO, Fox, Columbia, Universal, each had its own identity, its own stable of performers, its own machinery for feeding America images of glamour, grit, laughter, danger, and romance. Different studios offered different kinds of escape. MGM was famous for polish, stars, and elegance, the kind of world where even sorrow might wear a beautiful gown. Warner Brothers became known for tougher, faster urban stories, gangster films, social problem dramas, sharp dialogue, and working-class energy. RKO gave audiences Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing through spaces so graceful they seemed to have been built only for movement. Universal offered horror, which might sound like the opposite of escape until you think about it carefully. In a world full of invisible economic fear, a monster on a screen had a face. Dracula could be confronted. Frankenstein's creature could be seen. The Mummy had a shape. Sometimes named fear is easier to bear than nameless fear. The musicals of the Depression years deserve special attention because they were among the purest forms of cinematic escape and among the strangest. Busby Berkeley's musical numbers, with their overhead camera angles and huge geometric patterns of dancers, created images that no stage audience could have seen in the same way. Lines of women became flowers, wheels, waves, machines of synchronized beauty. The human body became pattern. The individual dancer disappeared into the design. There is something almost unsettling about it if you look too long, but it was also dazzling. Here was order. Here was abundance. Here were hundreds of bodies moving together perfectly at a time when real social order seemed badly shaken. Gold Diggers of 1933 is one of those films that tells you almost everything about the era in its contradictions. It is glamorous, funny, musical, and filled with backstage energy. But it also knows the Depression exists. Its famous closing number, Remember My Forgotten Man, directly evokes unemployed veterans and men left behind by the country they served. That is not escapism in the simple sense. That is escape and confrontation braided together. The audience could enjoy the glitter, the jokes, the songs, and then suddenly be reminded of the men outside the theatre. Hollywood did not always ask people to forget. Sometimes it allowed them to feel what they already knew, but with music, framing, and a sense that their private grief was part of something national. Comedies worked differently. A good comedy did not solve anything, and that was part of its value. The Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields, Mae West, Laurel and Hardy, and many others gave audiences worlds where authority could be mocked, rules bent, respectability punctured, and disaster turned into timing. When people feel powerless, watching someone talk back can be its own pleasure. Groucho Marx could insult the pompous. Mae West could stroll through moral judgment as if it were badly arranged furniture. Laurel and Hardy could fail and fail again, and somehow their failure did not become shame. It became rhythm. It became laughter. The gangster film offered another form of fantasy, darker and more complicated. In films like The Public Enemy and Little Caesar, audiences watched men seize power outside the rules. These stories often ended with punishment, partly because moral order had to be restored and later because censorship would demand it more firmly. But before the downfall came energy, ambition, speed, money, fine clothes, fearlessness. In a decade when honest work might not feed a family because the economy itself had failed, the gangster's rise carried a charge that polite society found troubling for good reason. Audiences did not necessarily want to become criminals, but they understood the appeal of watching someone refuse helplessness. Then there were the stars. This is where Depression-era Hollywood became almost religious in its emotional force. Stars were not simply actors. They were surfaces on which the public could rest its longing. Greta Garbo's face, Clark Gable's grin, Joan Crawford's hard upward striving, James Cagney's quick movements, Shirley Temple's curls and dimples, Fred Astaire's elegance, Ginger Rogers' poise, Jean Harlow's brightness. These were not just performances, they were repeated presences in people's lives. A star could become familiar in a way no politician or banker could. You might not trust the bank, but you knew what it felt like when a certain actor appeared on screen. Shirley Temple is especially revealing. Her rise in the mid-1930s came at a time when Americans were desperate for reassurance. Her films often placed a small, cheerful child in a troubled adult world, and through innocence, charm, song, and stubborn optimism she helped mend it. That formula could be sentimental, but sentiment is not always foolish. For audiences living through loss, the image of a child who could soften hardened men, reunite families, and make order return had real emotional power. Adults who had every reason to feel cynical paid to watch a little girl smile, because for an hour it helped them believe tenderness still had force. And yet, the screen worlds were often wildly unrealistic. Poor characters in Hollywood films could still have flattering light. Women who supposedly struggled might wear dresses no struggling woman could buy. Apartments were larger than real apartments. Problems resolved quickly. Love arrived on schedule. Songs emerged from nowhere. But that unreality was part of the bargain. People did not enter movie palaces hoping to see an exact copy of their own troubles. They had their own troubles at home. They entered because they wanted reality rearranged into something bearable, something shaped, something with an ending. I want to bring this down from Hollywood as an industry to one person in one seat. Imagine a woman named Ruth, though she could have had any name. She is 28 years old in 1934, married, with one child, and another perhaps hoped for but postponed because money is too uncertain. She has spent the day doing small economies that no one will applaud. She cut a worn sheet down the middle and sewed the outside edges together to make it last. She stretched leftover potatoes into supper. She told the grocer she would pay something next week and tried to sound confident. Her husband is quieter than he used to be. Not unkind, just quiet in a way that has settled over him since the layoffs. A sister or neighbour offers to watch the child for 2 hours, and Ruth goes to the movies. Maybe she goes with her husband, maybe with another woman, maybe alone, which was not unusual. She buys the ticket with money that could have gone elsewhere, and perhaps a small part of her feels guilty. That guilt follows her into the lobby, but then the lights, the carpet, the posters, the sound of the crowd begin their work. She sits down. The theatre darkens. The screen comes alive. For the first few minutes she may still be thinking about home. Did she bank the stove properly? Did she leave enough for breakfast? Will her husband find work tomorrow? Then the story catches. Not all at once. Gradually, her shoulders lower, her eyes adjust to the screen. She laughs because the people around her laugh, and then because something is actually funny. A song begins. A woman in satin descends a staircase that exists nowhere in Ruth's life and somehow belongs to her for as long as she watches it. The staircase is absurd. The satin is absurd. The lighting is absurd. But the feeling is real. That is what people who dismiss escapism often miss. The object may be artificial, but the relief is not. The set is fake. The emotion is not. The The palace interior may be plaster and paint pretending to be stone and gold, but the tired body resting in the seat is real. The laughter is real. The silence after a moving scene is real. The courage someone borrows for the walk home is real. The theatre also offered physical comfort, and that should not be underestimated. Many homes in the 1930s were uncomfortable by modern standards, especially for families under economic strain. Heating could be inadequate. Summer heat in cities could be oppressive. A theatre with good ventilation, heating or air conditioning was not merely entertaining. It was a refuge for the body. In summer, signs advertising cooling systems could be as attractive as the film title itself. To sit in a cool, dark room during a hot afternoon in a crowded city was a kind of luxury that did not need much explanation. Children experienced the movies differently, though perhaps even more intensely. A child in the Depression learned limits early. They learned which requests made adults tense. They learned that some treats disappeared without discussion. They learned to read the weather of a parent's face. But in the theatre, a child could enter a world of adventure and colour even before most films were in full colour. They could watch cowboys, cartoons, serial heroes, pirates, animals, comedians, and child stars. A boy who had no money could imagine bravery. A girl wearing a hand-me-down coat could imagine applause. For children, the movie screen did not only provide escape from hardship, it provided images to grow toward, even if those images were impossible. Of course, not everyone approved. Moral reformers had worried about movies since the Nickelodeon era, and by the early 1930s, concerns about crime, sexuality, vulgarity, and the influence of films on young people intensified. The production code, though written earlier, began to be enforced more strictly in 1934. After that, Hollywood films became more careful about what they could show and how they could show it. Crime could not appear too rewarding. Sexual suggestion had to be softened. Marriage and morality had to be respected more visibly. This changed the texture of escape. The wildness of some early 1930s films gave way to a more regulated dream, one that still sparkled but had stronger fences around it. And yet audiences kept coming. They adapted as audiences always do. They found pleasure in what was allowed. Romantic comedies became smoother. Musicals became more polished. Dramas found ways to suggest what they could not say directly. The art of implication became part of the pleasure. A look, a cutaway, a line delivered with a second meaning. All of it allowed adults in the audience to understand more than the censors might have preferred. Escape did not disappear under rules. It learned to move more quietly. There is another detail worth noticing. The movie theatre was one of the few places where Americans of different classes might share the same story, though not always the same seats or the same theatres. A wealthy person and a working-class person could see the same film, recognise the same star, hum the same song. In a country divided by money, region, race and opportunity, movies created a national common language. That does not mean movie-going was equal. Segregation shaped theatres in the South and elsewhere, with black audiences often forced into balconies, separate entrances, inferior seating, or entirely separate theatres. Many films themselves carried racial stereotypes and exclusions that reflected and reinforced the injustices of the time. Escape was not distributed evenly, and the dream on screen often left many Americans out or pushed them into demeaning roles. Black moviegoers, however, were not simply passive recipients of Hollywood's narrow imagination. They attended films, critiqued them, enjoyed what could be enjoyed, rejected what insulted them, and supported separate black theatres and race films that offered different images, different performers, and different forms of recognition. For a black audience in the Depression, escape could involve complicated negotiations, the pleasure of cinema, the pain of racist representation, and the importance of spaces where black life could appear with dignity. That, too, belongs in this story. Escaping reality is never the same for everyone because reality itself presses differently on different people. In small towns, the theatre held a special place. It might be one of the brightest buildings on Main Street, a social centre as much as an entertainment hall. People saw who was there, who came with whom, who could still afford a ticket, who looked thinner, who had new shoes, who did not. The theatre allowed privacy inside a public gathering. You could be seen entering, but once the lights went down, your face disappeared. That darkness was democratic in its own limited way. In the dark, the banker and the unemployed man both looked toward the same screen. Coming out was always the hardest part. This is true of almost every escape. There is the moment when the lights rise and the spell loosens. People stand, stretch, gather gloves and hats, wake sleeping children, move into aisles, and begin speaking in ordinary voices again. The palace becomes a building. The screen becomes blank. Outside, the street is still the street, the same closed shop fronts, the same cold air, the same unpaid bill waiting at home. The depression has not gone anywhere, but something has changed, even if only slightly. A melody remains. A joke is repeated on the walk home. A child imitates a cowboy. A woman remembers a dress from the film and thinks about altering an old one to look a little more like it. A man who has not smiled much all week finds himself describing a scene to a neighbour. For the length of the walk, the movie travels with them. This is one of the quiet powers of shared entertainment. It extends beyond its own ending. People carried films home in memory, in conversation, in gestures, in songs, in slang, in hairstyles, in dreams. Hollywood knew this and fed it. Fan magazines turned stars into household companions. Photographs, interviews, gossip columns, beauty tips, studio publicity, all of it extended the screen into daily life. A woman who could not buy a new wardrobe might still read about how a star dressed. A teenager might place a film star's picture near a mirror. A young man might copy a haircut or a way of standing. These imitations could be small, but they mattered. They let people borrow a little glamour without paying for the whole thing. There was something almost defiant in that borrowing. The depression reduced people. It reduced incomes, choices, meals, travel, plans, confidence. Movie culture expanded the imagination at the very moment material life was contracting. You might live in 2 rooms, but you had seen Paris on a set, a nightclub in Manhattan, a desert kingdom, a pirate ship, a penthouse, a stage, a ballroom, a jungle, a courtroom, a ranch, a haunted castle. Were these places real? Usually not in any serious way, but they gave the mind room to move, and maybe that is why the glow of the movie palace feels so important in this story. It was not only about forgetting, it was about refusing to let the depression define the full size of the life. A person could be poor and still have taste, out of work and still laugh, worried and still moved by beauty, hungry and still capable of delight. The theatre did not cure hunger or unemployment, but it protected something inside people that hardship was trying to wear away. Let us return once more to the street after the show. The crowd is spilling out beneath the marquee. The bulbs are still burning. The posters are still promising another world to the next audience. Some people turn up collars against the cold. Some linger, not wanting to go home immediately. A couple pauses near the curb and talks about the ending. 2 children act out a scene until their mother tells them to stop before they tear their coats. A man lights a cigarette and stands for a moment under the sign, his face bright from above, tired again, but not quite as tired as before. The theatre doors open and close behind him. Inside, the ushers are already moving through the aisles. Programmes are being reset. Seats are being checked. The projector booth is warm. The reels are ready. Another audience will come soon, carrying its own worries, its own coins, its own need to sit in the dark and look toward light. And beyond the theatre, in apartments and boarding houses and farm kitchens and small rooms across the country, Another kind of glow is waiting too. Smaller than the movie screen, less glamorous, but in some ways even more intimate. It comes from a wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, from tubes warming slowly, from static gathering and clearing, from a voice travelling through the air into a house where people have pulled their chairs close and gone quiet enough to listen. At first, the radio did not sound like comfort. It sounded like static, a low hiss, a crackle, a little whistle of distance, a thin, restless noise of invisible weather passing through the room. Someone would lean toward the cabinet and turn the dial slowly, carefully, as if the right voice were hidden behind a locked door and the knob with a key. The sound would rise and fall. A station would appear for half a second, then vanish. A burst of music might come through, then a man's voice, then static again. Children learned to be quiet during this process because tuning a radio in the 1930s required patience, and patience was one of the household skills the Depression taught, whether anyone wanted to learn it or not. Then, suddenly, the signal would settle. A voice would become clear enough to understand. Not perfect, not clean the way modern sound is clean, but present. That was the miracle. A human voice travelling through the air, arriving in a small room where the shades had been pulled down and the evening had gathered in the corners. It might be a comedian. It might be a singer. It might be a baseball announcer. It might be the President of the United States. Whoever it was, the effect could feel strangely intimate, because the voice was not coming from a stage far away in any ordinary sense. It was coming from the furniture. It was coming from the corner of your own room. It was speaking to you where you lived. For families during the Great Depression, this mattered in a way that is difficult to recover now because we are surrounded by voices all the time. Voices come from phones, televisions, computers, cars, elevators, stores, watches, public screens and headphones. We can summon almost any sound we want instantly, and because of that, sound has become cheap in our minds. But in the 1930s, radio still carried a sense of wonder. It was ordinary enough that millions of families owned sets or listened at a neighbour's house, but not so ordinary that people had stopped noticing what it could do. It brought the outside world into rooms that might otherwise have been very small. It turned the household into an audience. It gave the evening a centre that was not the unpaid bill, not the empty work pail, not the silence of adults trying not to frighten the children. Picture that family again, the one we have been following in spirit. The movie theatre is still glowing somewhere downtown, but tonight there is no money for tickets, or the weather is bad, or the children are already too tired to go out. They are home. The supper dishes have been washed. The father has taken off his shoes because his feet ache from walking. The mother has a basket of mending beside her, because even while listening her hands will not be idle. A child sits on the floor with knees pulled up, close to the radio cabinet, not because being closer makes much difference, but because the radio feels almost alive and children instinctively move closer to living things. The cabinet itself is worth imagining. Not a small plastic object, not a device tossed on a shelf, but a piece of furniture. Many radios of the period were built into wooden cases polished enough to belong in the front room. Some were tall consoles, standing on legs, with cloth speaker grills and glowing dials. Others were smaller tabletop sets, still treated with care. The radio was not just an appliance. In many homes, it was one of the most important possessions the family had. If they had bought it before the crash, they might have held on to it through everything that followed. If they were paying in installments, the payment might have become one more monthly worry. If they could not afford one, they might visit a neighbour who could, or listen in a store, or crowd around a public set when something important was being broadcast. And here is something I want you to feel, not just know. A radio in a Depression home did not remove poverty from the room. It sat inside poverty. It shared space with patched socks, watered soup, old newspapers, worn linoleum, and furniture that had seen better years. That contrast is part of the power of it. The radio was a doorway that did not require leaving the house. It was cheaper than a movie after the initial cost of the set. It could entertain the whole family at once. It did not ask anyone to dress well, buy a ticket, pay a sitter, or pretend to be more prosperous than they were. You could listen in a housecoat. You could listen while sewing. You could listen while shelling beans, ironing, cleaning, nursing a baby, polishing shoes, or simply sitting very still because the day had taken more from you than you wanted to admit. By the early 1930s, radio had become one of the dominant forces in American life. The major networks, especially NBC and CBS, carried programs across the country, making it possible for families in different cities, towns and farms to hear the same comedians, singers, dramas, news bulletins and political speeches at nearly the same time. That simultaneity is important. The Depression had isolated people in many ways. Unemployment made men feel ashamed. Poverty made families withdraw. Farmers stranded by drought or low crop prices could feel forgotten. But radio created a sense that the country was listening together. A family in Ohio, a boarding house in Chicago, a farm in Iowa, an apartment in Brooklyn, a parlour in Georgia, and a kitchen in Oregon could all hear the same opening music and know, without seeing one another, that others were gathered too. There is comfort in being part of an unseen crowd. Movie audiences offered that comfort in public. Radio offered it privately. You were alone in your own room, but not alone in the larger sense. The same joke that made your father laugh might be making someone laugh 3 states away. The same speech that quieted your kitchen might be quieting thousands of kitchens. In a decade when many Americans felt abandoned by banks, employers, markets, weather and fate, radio suggested that a national conversation still existed and that ordinary people had not been entirely left outside it. Of course, the radio did not speak in one voice. It offered many kinds of escape, and each had its own function. There were comedy programs, and comedy was one of the most necessary forms of emotional relief in the Depression. Jack Benny, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Fred Allen and others built routines around timing, vanity, foolishness, misunderstanding, money, marriage, status, and the endless comic possibilities of people trying to appear more competent than they were. That last part mattered. Depression audiences understood embarrassment. They understood keeping up appearances. They understood pretending things were all right. A comedian who made dignity collapse safely, who let people laugh at foolishness without making ruin permanent, gave listeners a way to release tension. Radio comedy was different from film comedy because it entered the house at the level of conversation. You did not see a face unless you already knew it from photographs or stage appearances. You had to imagine the room, the gesture, the expression, the timing. The laugh came from voices, pauses, reactions, catchphrases, and the audience in the studio responding before you did. A good radio comedian made a family feel as if they had invited a funny relative into the room, someone who would talk too much, misunderstand everything, and leave before becoming a burden. Then there were serial dramas, and these may have been even more intimate. A serial did not give everything at once. It returned day after day or week after week, carrying listeners along through trouble, romance, danger, family conflict, mystery, and suspense. The form suited the Depression because life itself had become serial. Nothing resolved quickly. Every problem continued into tomorrow. A radio serial gave that continuation shape. It promised that if you came back at the same time, the story would still be there and something would happen next. That promise can seem small until you imagine a household where so many real promises had already failed. Daytime serials, many of them sponsored by soap companies, reached women especially, though not only women. They played into the rhythms of domestic labour. A woman could listen while washing dishes, ironing shirts, preparing food, tending children, or doing piecework. The radio kept her company in hours when other adults might be absent and the work itself offered little recognition. This is one of the quietest and most important forms of escape, not being transported to a palace or battlefield, but being accompanied through the work you must do anyway. The voice on the radio did not finish the laundry. It did not mend the shirt. It did not reduce the price of flour. But it made the room less empty. For children, radio adventure programs opened a different kind of door. The Lone Ranger first appeared on radio in 1933, and he rode into the imagination of a country badly in need of figures who acted decisively. Here was a masked man with a moral code, a horse, a companion, and a clear distinction between right and wrong. The world of the program was dangerous, but it was understandable. Villains could be identified. Justice could arrive. In real life, the causes of the Depression were vast and complicated, spread across markets, policies, banking systems, industrial practices, agriculture, international debt, and plain bad luck. No child could defeat those things. No adult could point to one man in a black hat and say, "There, that is the problem." But in a radio western, the problem had a voice, a plan, a hideout. It could be chased. Little Orphan Annie also became a fixture of children's radio listening, blending adventure, danger, loyalty, and the recurring appeal of a child surviving in a world of adults. The idea of an orphan heroine or child adventurer resonated in a time when many children felt insecurity even if they had parents at home. Annie's world was not safe, but she was resourceful. That mattered. Depression childhood was often full of overheard worry. Children might not understand stock prices or mortgage terms, but they understood the tone in a parent's voice. They knew when a treat had vanished. They knew when a father had no work. Radio gave them stories where children could be brave, clever, and important. Music was another form of escape, and perhaps the most direct. A song can reach places an argument cannot. Dance bands, crooners, gospel music, country performers, jazz orchestras, and popular singers came through radios into homes where no live band would ever play. People heard Bing Crosby's smooth voice, Duke Ellington's orchestra, Guy Lombardo, Kate Smith, and countless others who filled the evening with melody. Some families pushed back furniture and danced in the front room. Some did not dance but listened. Some sang along if they knew the words. Music could make a poor room feel temporarily larger, not by hiding the walls, but by filling them. There is a detail here that I find especially moving. During the Depression, many people could not afford to buy records often, and live entertainment might be out of reach. Radio made music available without requiring a new purchase every time. Once the set was there, once the tubes warmed and the signal came through, music arrived as if the air itself had become generous. That generosity was not truly free, of course. Programs were sponsored. Advertisements were woven into the experience. Companies sold soap, cereal, tobacco, coffee, toothpaste, and household goods through the voices people trusted. But for the listener sitting in a dim room, the bargain could still feel worthwhile. A sales pitch was a small price to pay for half an hour of song. And then there was Franklin Roosevelt. It is impossible to talk about radio during the Great Depression without talking about the fireside chats, because they reveal perhaps better than anything else how radio could be both escape and confrontation. Roosevelt did not use the radio only to distract Americans from their troubles. He used it to speak directly about those troubles in a tone that felt personal and controlled. His first fireside chat in March 1933 addressed the banking crisis. Banks had failed. People were frightened. Confidence had collapsed. Roosevelt spoke in plain language, explaining what had happened and what the government was doing. The genius of the broadcast was not just the information, it was the feeling. He sounded calm. He sounded as if he believed the situation could be managed. In a nation full of panic, calm itself became a form of relief. Imagine listening to that in a dark room. Perhaps the family has very little money in a bank, or perhaps they had savings and lost them, or perhaps they have no savings at all but understand that if banks fail, everything around them becomes even more uncertain. The president's voice comes through the radio not as a distant speech delivered from a platform, but as something near enough to enter the household. He does not solve your problem while you listen. But he gives it shape. He turns the terror of rumour into sentences. He says in effect, this is what we face and this is what is being done. That can be powerful. People can endure a great deal when they feel someone has named the danger clearly. The term fireside chat itself helped create intimacy. Many Americans did not have grand fireplaces, and some had no fireplace at all, but the phrase suggested domestic warmth, an evening circle, a leader speaking not over the people, but to them. Roosevelt's radio presence became one of the defining political tools of the age. He understood that the microphone required a different kind of performance than a balcony speech. You did not shout at a radio listener. You entered the room. You paced yourself. You let silence do some work. You sounded steady enough that a tired father might believe tomorrow was worth trying again. This does not mean everyone loved Roosevelt or trusted him. The country was full of disagreement, criticism, anger, and political division. Some thought he went too far. Some thought he did not go far enough. Some blamed him for changes they feared. Others credited him with saving the country from collapse. But even critics had to reckon with the new power of radio politics. The president had found a way to reach past newspapers, party bosses, and public halls into private space. That changed American democracy. It also changed the emotional texture of the Depression. The government was no longer only something that sent forms, agents, laws, or relief checks. It had a voice. News broadcasts, too, brought the world into the home. That could be comforting, but it could also be frightening. The 1930s were not only the years of American economic crisis, they were also years of rising tension abroad, fascism in Europe, militarism in Asia, unrest, speeches, invasions, and warnings that the world was moving toward something dangerous. Radio made distant events immediate. A family trying to forget the price of coal could hear about Hitler, Mussolini, strikes, wars, floods, elections, and disasters. This is why radio was never simply an escape machine. It was a reality machine as well. The same device that carried comedy also carried dread, and yet even dread was altered by being shared. A newspaper could be read alone. A radio bulletin stopped the room. Someone might hush the children. A mother might pause with a needle halfway through cloth. A father might lean forward. The voice would tell them what had happened, and for a moment the household became alert together. Then the program would change. Music might return. A sponsor might speak brightly about soap flakes or coffee. That sudden swing from crisis to advertisement can feel absurd to us, but it was part of the rhythm of radio. The world was alarming, and the dishes still had to be washed. A dictator spoke overseas, and someone still needed to sell toothpaste. The Depression trained people to live with those collisions. Not all radio escape was innocent. One of the most popular programs of the era, Amos and Andy, drew enormous audiences, but it was built on racist caricature, performed for years by white actors imitating black characters for a national audience. To understand the 1930s honestly, we have to hold both facts at once. Millions listened and laughed. The program became a national habit. It also carried forward the long, damaging traditions of minstrelsy and racial mockery. For white listeners, it could function as comedy and routine. For black Americans, the experience was more complicated and often painful, though responses varied. Some black listeners found humour in parts of it, some objected strongly, and black newspapers and organisations criticised the ways such portrayals shaped public imagination. Escapism can comfort one audience while injuring another. The radio in the dark room did not erase the inequalities of the room, the street, or the country. It carried them. Segregation shaped radio too, though sometimes in less visible ways than theatre seating. Black musicians, preachers, comedians, and speakers reached audiences through certain stations and programs, but network opportunities were limited by racism in the industry and society. At the same time, black radio listening communities formed around music, church broadcasts, local announcements, and performers whose voices carried recognition that mainstream programming often denied. For black families during the Depression, radio could mean escape, information, spiritual support, and frustration all at once. A gospel song broadcast into a kitchen could strengthen people for another week. A racist joke on a national program could remind them exactly how the larger culture saw them. The same device opened doors and closed them. Rural Americans experienced radio differently again. In cities, radios could usually draw power from household electricity. In rural areas, especially before electrification reached many farms, families used battery-powered sets or found other arrangements. Batteries had to be charged. Reception could be difficult. Weather mattered. Distance mattered. But for isolated farm families, radio could be astonishingly valuable. It brought market prices, weather reports, farm advice, music, church services, news and entertainment across miles of road that might be muddy, snowed in, or simply too far from town for regular social life. During the Dust Bowl years, when farm families in parts of the plains faced drought, crop failure, dust storms, debt and displacement, the radio could be one of the few connections to a world beyond the blowing dirt. Think of a farm kitchen at night. The room smells faintly of kerosene, wood smoke, dust and coffee. The day has been spent fighting conditions no person can fully control. The sky itself has become untrustworthy. Dust can move like weather and enter every crack. Crops fail. Animals suffer. Children cough. A battery radio sits on a shelf or table, and when it works, it brings in music from a city so far away it may as well be another country. That sound does not change the field outside, but it tells the family they are still connected to something human beyond the horizon. In hard country, that was not a small thing. Radio also shaped time. Programs came on at set hours, and households arranged themselves around them. This is easy to underestimate. When life is unstable, routine becomes precious. A favourite programme at the same time each week could give the evening a structure that unemployment had taken from the day. Work used to organise time. The whistle blew, the shift began, the shift ended, pay came. When that structure vanished, people were left with long stretches of waiting. Radio helped mark the hours, the children's programme after supper, the comedy later, the news at a certain time, the president when announced, a serial tomorrow. The act of waiting for something pleasant is different from the act of simply waiting. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever had a voice you relied on, not because you knew the person, but because their voice appeared at the right time? Maybe a broadcaster, a narrator, a singer, a host, someone whose presence became part of your evening without ever entering your life in the ordinary way. That relationship can be strange, but it is real. During the Depression, radio created millions of such relationships. A lonely person could feel accompanied by a performer who never knew they existed. A child could feel loyalty to a hero whose adventures were written in a studio. A family could feel that Roosevelt was speaking to them personally, even though he spoke to millions. The intimacy was manufactured, but the comfort was genuine. Inside the home, listening had its own etiquette. Someone controlled the dial, often an adult, because the set was valuable and not to be handled carelessly. Children were told not to fiddle with it. Conversations lowered when a favourite programme began. Visitors might be invited to stay and listen. Neighbours might come over for special broadcasts, especially if they did not own a set. Chairs were pulled closer. Lights might be dimmed, partly for atmosphere, partly from habit, partly because there was no reason to keep the whole room bright when everyone was listening rather than reading. In that dimness, faces turned toward the cabinet as if toward a hearth. That comparison matters. In earlier households, the hearth had gathered people because warmth and light came from one place. In the 1930s, the radio gathered people because sound came from one place. The family circle shifted from fire to speaker. The glow was smaller, maybe just the soft light of the dial, but the effect was similar. It gave the room a centre. It made scattered people sit near one another. It created a shared experience without demanding much speech. In families strained by worry, that could be a blessing. Not every family had the emotional energy for conversation. Listening together allowed closeness without forcing anyone to explain themselves. There is tenderness in that. A father who felt ashamed because he had not found work did not have to describe his shame while a comedy played. A mother who was frightened about money could keep sewing and laugh when the joke came. Children could lean against adults without asking questions no one wanted to answer. For 30 minutes, the family did not have to solve itself. It only had to listen. But after the programme ended, reality returned in its usual quiet way. The announcer signed off. The music faded. Static filled the gap. Someone turned the knob and the cabinet became wood again. The father might stand and stretch. The mother might fold the mending. A child might ask what happened in the story if they had missed a line. Outside, the street or field or alley remained dark. Tomorrow would still come with its demands. Still, the room had changed. It had held voices. It had held laughter. It had held a story that did not belong only to that family's troubles. The depression was full of such temporary rescues. A radio program could not feed anyone, but it could keep despair from having the room entirely to itself. That may sound modest, but modest comforts are often the ones people actually live on. Not every rescue is dramatic. Sometimes it is a song at 8:15. Sometimes it's a joke repeated at breakfast. Sometimes it's a president's calm voice during a bank panic. Sometimes it is a child lying in bed after an adventure program, imagining hoofbeats in the dark instead of eviction notices, dust storms, or the worried whispers of adults. The radio cabinet sits quiet now. The tubes cool. The last warmth leaves the back of the set. The family begins moving toward bed, though perhaps not all at once. Someone checks the door. Someone folds a newspaper. Someone sets out what little can be prepared for morning. The room that had been connected to the whole country returns to its own size. But tomorrow evening, if the electricity holds, if the battery is charged, if the set keeps working, if no one has had to sell it, the voices will come back. And in other houses, other rooms, other streets, other farms, people will gather again. Not every escape required stillness, though. Some Americans could not sit quietly with their fear. Some needed noise, bodies, cards on a table, dice in a hand, music under their feet. Some physical proof that they were still alive and not only waiting. For them, the door out of reality was not always a screen or a speaker. Sometimes it was a dance floor, a marathon hall, a parlour game, a church basement, a kitchen table, or a strange new board where paper money passed from hand to hand, and everyone, for once, could pretend to own the whole block. Not everyone wanted the evening to be quiet. For some people, silence was exactly the problem. Silence left too much room for the mind to wander back to the same questions it had been carrying all day. How much money was left? Whether the landlord would wait? Whether the factory would reopen? Whether the letter from a brother out west meant hope? Or only another form of disappointment? A radio voice could soothe one household, but another person might need something rougher, louder, more physical. They needed the body to get involved. They needed music under their feet, cards in their hands, dice on the table, a crowd pressing close, someone calling numbers, someone laughing too loudly, someone saying, "Come on, one more round, one more dance, one more hour." This is one of the stranger things about the Great Depression. A decade remembered for hunger, waiting, and unemployment also became a decade of games. Not only games in the cheerful sense, though there were plenty of those. Games of endurance, games of chance, games of make-believe wealth, games that cost almost nothing, games that turned exhaustion into spectacle, games that let people imagine movement in a world where their real lives had stalled. If the movie palace offered escape by making the world look grand, and the radio offered escape by filling a room with voices, the dance hall and the kitchen table offered something else. They gave people a small set of rules at a time when the larger rules of life seemed to have broken down. That may sound simple, but sit with it for a moment. During the Depression, millions of Americans were trapped in circumstances they had not chosen and could not personally fix. A careful worker could lose a job. A sober farmer could lose a farm. A responsible saver could lose money in a bank failure. A young person could do everything adults had told them to do and still find no work waiting. That kind of helplessness is corrosive. It eats at the old belief that effort and reward belong together. But a game, even a foolish one, restores that relationship for a little while. You roll the dice, you move the piece, you play the card, you take the trick. You dance through the hour, you remain in the contest. The rules may be arbitrary, but at least they can be seen. Let us begin with the dance marathons, because they are among the most haunting entertainments of the Depression years. At first glance, they sound almost comic, one of those odd old crazes people mention with a smile, like swallowing goldfish or sitting on flagpoles, couples dancing until they collapse, spectators paying to watch, prize money promised to whoever lasts the longest. It sounds absurd, and in a way it was, but once you place it inside the Depression, the laughter gets caught in your throat a little. Dance marathons had begun before the worst of the economic crisis, becoming popular in the 1920s when endurance contests of all kinds fascinated the public. Americans had developed a taste for watching people test the limits of the body. How long can someone dance? How long can someone sit? How long can someone ride a bicycle, walk, swim, stay awake, stay upright? The modern world was producing machines, speed, records, timers and headlines, and endurance became a form of public drama. But in the 1930s, the dance marathon changed. It became less like a fad and more like a temporary economy for people who had been pushed out of the real one. Picture a large hall in 1932, not glamorous like a movie palace, more likely a converted ballroom, an armoury, a sports arena, a pavilion, somewhere with enough floor space, enough room for spectators, and enough doors to manage the crowd. Banners hang overhead. A band plays in shifts, or recorded music turns when live musicians are too expensive. The floor is crowded with couples who have already been dancing for hours, maybe days, maybe longer. Their clothes are rumpled, their hair has lost its shape. The women's shoes are worn soft and painful. The men's faces have that pale, unfocused look people get when sleep has become a memory rather than a recent event. The rules varied from contest to contest, but the basic idea was brutal in its simplicity. Couples had to keep moving. They could slow down. They could shuffle. They could lean on each other. They could drift in circles barely worthy of the word dancing. But they could not simply stop. Often they were allowed short rest periods, sometimes 15 minutes out of every hour, during which they might collapse onto cots, eat, wash quickly, change socks, or fall into a sleep so deep it almost looked medical. Then they were awakened and sent back to the floor. If one partner could not continue, the couple was usually disqualified, unless a replacement was allowed. The last couple standing or shuffling or half-conscious might win a cash prize. Now imagine why someone would enter. This is the part that matters. A participant might receive food during the contest. They might have a place indoors. They might get attention. They might have a chance, however slim, at prize money. In a world where work was scarce and pride had taken repeated blows, staying on your feet in a marathon hall could seem like a kind of job. A terrible job, yes. A humiliating one in some ways. But it had a clear task. Keep moving. It had meals. It had rules. It had the possibility of reward. For some young people, especially those with little else available, that was enough. There is something deeply unsettling about the phrase keep moving when you think about the Depression. The whole nation seemed to be telling people to keep moving. Move from factory gate to factory gate. Move from town to town. Move west if the farm fails. Move along if you're loitering. Move through the bread line. Move your family into a smaller room. Move your pride out of the way and ask for relief. The dance marathon turned that command into entertainment. People paid to watch other people keep moving beyond the point where movement looked humanly reasonable. It was not subtle, it was not kind. But it was honest in a way that makes it hard to look away from. Spectators came for many reasons. Some came because admission was cheap and the hall was lively. Some came to root for a favourite couple. Some came for the spectacle of collapse, though they may not have admitted it that plainly. Promoters understood drama. They staged eliminations, special contests, sprints, comic routines, weddings, mock trials, theme nights, and emotional appeals. They gave the audience people to care about and people to gossip about. A couple from a hard luck background might become local heroes. A dancer who fainted might bring gasps and whispers. A romance might be encouraged because romance sold tickets. Pain became narrative. Exhaustion became plot. And the crowd, many of them poor or worried themselves, watched. That is the part that feels uncomfortable. Why would people who are suffering pay to watch other people suffer? The answer is not simple cruelty. Human beings often watch endurance because it gives suffering a shape. In ordinary life, depression suffering was scattered and private. You worried at home. You failed alone. You stood in line with your eyes lowered. But in the marathon hall, struggle had lights around it. It had music. It had announcers. It had rules. It had a scoreboard. A tired dancer's pain was visible, measurable, and shared. That visibility could be strangely compelling to people whose own pain had no audience and no prize. Some cities and reformers tried to stop dance marathons, and for good reason. There were concerns about health, exploitation, public decency, gambling, and the sheer cruelty of the events. Reports of contestants collapsing, suffering injuries, becoming delirious or being pushed too far helped fuel opposition. By the mid-1930s, many places had restricted or banned the worst forms of these contests. But for a time, they flourished because they fit the emotional weather of the country. They were desperate entertainment for desperate years. I want to bring this down from the public spectacle to one couple on the floor. Let them be young, maybe not yet married, maybe recently married, maybe strangers paired by circumstance. The woman has pinned her hair tightly because loose hair makes the heat worse. The man's shirt sticks to his back. They have been awake too long. At first they danced properly, then they stepped, then they shuffled. Now they move because stopping would mean losing. The band is playing something cheerful, almost insultingly cheerful, and the audience is clapping along. Her feet hurt so much that the pain has become a steady background instead of a sharp complaint. His arm is around her waist, less like romance now, and more like scaffolding. They are holding each other up because the rules require it, but also because the body, under enough strain, stops pretending it is independent. Every hour the rest period comes, 15 minutes. That number becomes sacred. They stumble off the floor and someone gives them food. Not a fine meal, something practical. Soup, bread, coffee, maybe fruit if available, something to keep the body functioning. They sit or lie down. A volunteer or attendant rubs legs, checks feet, wakes them if they sleep too deeply. Then a bell, a whistle, a command, and they return to the floor. The audience sees them come back and applauds. Maybe the applause helps. Maybe it makes the whole thing worse. Both can be true. This was escape, but not escape from hardship into ease. It was escape from one kind of hardship into another kind that had clearer terms. That is the strange comfort of exhaustion. When the mind is frightened, the body can become a refuge if it's given something specific to do. Dance until the bell. Hold on until the next rest. Make it through this song. Make it through this hour. The larger future may be terrifying, but the immediate task is plain. Not all depression dancing was so grim. We should not let the marathon hall swallow the whole story. Ordinary dance halls, community dances, church socials, school gyms, union halls, and neighbourhood gatherings also offered genuine pleasure. People danced because dancing was one of the cheapest ways to feel alive in public. A band or a record player, a cleared floor, a few coins, and suddenly the week changed shape. Swing music began rising in national popularity in the 1930s, and even before the full swing craze reached its height, dancing allowed young people especially to be stylish without owning much. You might have one decent dress, one pressed shirt, one pair of shoes kept carefully for Saturday night, and for a few hours that could be enough. Dance also let people touch within rules. That mattered in a decade when courtship, respectability and money were all tangled together. Marriage was often delayed because men could not support a household. Engagement stretched. Couples walked instead of going out. Families crowded into small spaces. Privacy was scarce. A dance hall offered music, motion, flirtation, and the temporary illusion that youth had not been entirely cancelled by the economy. A young man with empty pockets could still learn a good step. A young woman wearing a remade dress could still be admired. The Depression took many futures from people, but on a dance floor, the next few minutes still belonged to rhythm. If dance marathons turned exhaustion into spectacle, board games turned imagination into property, travel, luck and control. This is where the story moves from the public hall back into the home, from bodies under bright lights to hands around a table. The kitchen table during the Depression carried many burdens. It was where meals were stretched, bills were opened, sewing was done, homework was completed, letters were written, and sometimes tears were quietly hidden. But clear the dishes, bring out cards or a game board, and the table could become something else. A battlefield, a market, a racetrack, a city, a word puzzle, a place where everyone agreed to pretend for a while. Cards were everywhere because they were cheap, durable and flexible. A single deck could produce endless evenings. Bridge, rummy, pinochle, euchre depending on region, solitaire for one person, simple games for children, gambling games when people were willing to risk small coins or matches or pride. Card games have a particular intimacy. They let people talk without making talk the whole purpose. You can sit with neighbours, play a hand, complain about the weather, share news, avoid painful topics, and still feel sociable. The cards give the eyes somewhere to go. They provide little bursts of suspense, a good draw, a bad discard, a bluff, a mistake, a lucky turn. These are small emotions, but small emotions are useful when the larger ones have become too heavy. Jigsaw puzzles also became a Depression-era pastime, especially because they could be inexpensive and absorbing. Some families bought them, some rented them from lending libraries, or exchanged them with neighbours. The appeal is easy to understand. A puzzle begins as disorder. Pieces scattered, colours broken, no obvious whole. Then slowly, through patience, edges are found, shapes fit, fragments become image. During a period when national life itself seemed broken into pieces, the quiet act of making a picture whole again had a satisfaction beyond mere distraction. No one needed to say that out loud. They only needed to lean over the table and find the piece of sky that matched the other piece of sky. Bingo grew in popularity in this era as well, especially in churches, community gatherings, and fundraising events. It was simple, social, and filled with the delicious suspense of almost winning. Almost is an important word in Depression entertainment. Almost employed. Almost able to pay, almost caught up, almost better. In bingo, almost could be playful instead of cruel. One number away. Waiting. Holding your breath. Then someone else calls out first, and everyone groans, laughs, reshuffles the feeling, and begins again. The stakes could be small, but the room became alive with shared anticipation. And then there was Monopoly, perhaps the most revealing game of the Depression years. Its story is more complicated than the legend often told. The deeper roots go back to the landlord's game, created by Elizabeth McGee in the early 1900s, as a way to demonstrate ideas about land ownership, rent, and economic inequality. Over time, versions of the game circulated and changed. In the 1930s, Charles Darrow sold a version to Parker Brothers, and Monopoly became a commercial success after 1935. That timing is almost too perfect. In the middle of the Great Depression, Americans gathered around tables to buy property, charge rent, build houses and hotels, mortgage assets, collect cash, and drive opponents into bankruptcy. It sounds like a cruel joke, and maybe part of its appeal was that it allowed the cruelty of capitalism to be handled like cardboard. The real estate market could destroy a family in real life. On the board, you could own Boardwalk, you could put a hotel on it, you could make someone else pay. The money was brightly coloured and replaceable. The deeds fit in your hand. The bank was a stack of paper under the control of a player who was probably also eating crackers. If you went broke, you could complain, laugh, tip back in your chair, and play again tomorrow. I want you to imagine a family playing it in 1936. The father has no property beyond perhaps the furniture around him, and some of that may not be fully paid for. The mother is careful with real money to the penny. The children have overheard words like mortgage, foreclosure, rent, relief, and taxes with a seriousness they cannot entirely understand. Now the board is spread out. The pieces are passed around. Someone gets the little iron, or the top hat, or the shoe. The children like the tokens because they are small and solid and feel important. The father becomes the banker, maybe with mock grandeur. The mother says she is not going to be cheated. Everyone laughs. The dice roll. A child buys a railroad. Another lands on chance. The father groans theatrically when he must pay rent. The mother quietly builds a dangerous block of properties and reveals a competitive streak everyone knows about, but rarely sees so clearly. For an hour or two, money moves freely. People make decisions with confidence. They take risks. They bargain. They complain about luck instead of hunger. They handle property cards in a rented apartment and experience the absurd pleasure of ownership without consequence. The game does not hide the logic of the world. It miniaturizes it until it can be survived. Board games and parlour games also had the advantage of keeping people home. During the Depression, home entertainment mattered because going out cost money. Families invited neighbours over. Children played on floors. Adults played cards after supper. Someone might bring a pie if there was enough to share, or coffee stretched thin, or nothing but themselves. Social life became more informal in many communities because formal entertaining required resources. You did not need a full dinner to have people over for cards. You did not need new clothes to sit at a kitchen table with familiar neighbours. You needed warmth, a deck, maybe a lamp, and the willingness to let the evening become something other than waiting. There is a tenderness in those small gatherings. People who might have been ashamed to ask directly for help could exchange help through play. A neighbour learned that another family was short on coal. Someone mentioned a temporary job. Someone brought over extra beans the next day without making a speech about charity. The game gave everyone a reason to gather, and gathering allowed information and support to move quietly. In hard times, entertainment often carried practical functions beneath the surface. Children's games worked the same way. Hopscotch, marbles, tag, stickball in the street, jump rope rhymes, homemade toys, paper dolls cut from catalogues, dolls repaired again and again, toy cars made from scraps, forts built from boxes, games invented out of nothing. Children are experts in making worlds from shortage. Adults may look at a lack of toys and see deprivation, and often it was. But children also created rules, territories, rivalries, and dramas from whatever was available. A vacant lot could become a stadium. A stoop could become a stage. Chalk on pavement could become a map. The Depression forced many children to grow up too quickly, but play remained one of the ways they protected some part of childhood from being taken entirely. Some of the games were rough, because childhood itself was rougher. Boys played in streets where cars, carts, and adults moved through the same space. Girls often balanced play with chores and younger siblings. Many children worked, scavenged, sold newspapers, shined shoes, helped at home, or took on responsibilities modern childhood would not expect of them. But even then, a game could appear in the cracks. A race down an alley. A contest of who could jump the farthest. A baseball made from tape and string. A bat that had been repaired until it was more memory than wood. Play did not require plenty. It required other children and a little time. For adults, games of chance carried a sharper edge. Lotteries, numbers games, betting on races, small wagers on cards, office pools where offices still existed, backroom games, all of these promised the one thing steady work no longer reliably promised: sudden change. A small bet could become a fantasy of rescue. This could be dangerous, of course. People with very little could lose what they could not afford. Reformers worried about gambling, and families fought over it. But the appeal is understandable. When ordinary paths to security are blocked, luck becomes more attractive. The roll of dice seems no less rational than waiting for a factory to reopen. The same desire helps explain the popularity of contests. Dance marathons were only one form. There were talent contests, amateur nights, eating contests, endurance events, raffles, promotional competitions, newspaper puzzles, and sweepstakes. Anything that offered a prize offered a story people could enter. Most did not win. Almost no one wins such things. But entering gave the imagination a direction. Maybe this time, maybe us, maybe me. Amateur nights in theatres and local halls deserve a place here because they turned performance into possibility. A young singer, comic, dancer or musician could get on stage before a local audience and try to be noticed. Sometimes the audience was merciless. Sometimes it was generous. The famous Apollo Theatre in Harlem began its amateur night tradition in the 1930s, and similar events elsewhere reflected the hunger for discovery and recognition. For a performer, an amateur contest might mean a little prize money, a booking, applause, or simply proof that they had something the depression had not crushed. For the audience, it offered the pleasure of judging, cheering, booing, and watching ordinary people step briefly into the light. This is one of the threads running through all depression escape. The desire to be seen. Unemployment made people feel invisible. Poverty often demands invisibility. You hide need. You hide shame. You hide worn clothing, unpaid bills, family tension. But entertainment, even amateur entertainment, reversed that. A dancer on a marathon floor, a singer at amateur night, a bingo winner, a child winning a street race, a player taking boardwalk, all became visible for a moment. Their names might be called. Their friends might cheer. The room might turn toward them. That kind of recognition can feed a person in a way that is not food, but still matters. Of course, exhaustion remained. That word belongs in the centre of this scene: depression. Americans were tired in many different ways. The employed were tired from working harder for less, afraid that any complaint might cost them their place. The unemployed were tired from looking for work, which is its own kind of labour and can be more humiliating than a job. Mothers were tired from stretching households beyond reason. Farmers were tired from fighting weather, debt, and collapsing prices. Children were tired from worry they were not supposed to understand. Some people escaped through rest, but many escaped through a chosen exhaustion, because chosen exhaustion felt different from the exhaustion imposed by fear. Think of dancing until the feet hurt because music is playing and other people are laughing. Think of playing cards past midnight, because stopping means returning to the quiet. Think of leaning over a puzzle until your eyes ache because one more piece must fit somewhere. Think of children playing stickball until dark because home is crowded and the street, for once, feels like theirs. These forms of tiredness had meaning. They were not simply the wear of survival. They were proof that the body could still spend itself on something other than worry. There is a scene I keep coming back to when I think about this. A small apartment, late evening, 4 adults around a table, 2 are married, 2 are neighbours from upstairs. The children are asleep or pretending to be. A single lamp is on, not bright, just enough for cards. The The room smells of coffee and cigarette smoke and the faint cooked smell that lingers after supper. Outside, the city has gone quieter, though never fully quiet. The men have both been looking for work. One found a day's labour unloading freight and is sore from it. The other found nothing. The women have spent the day making small economies, trading news, keeping households moving. Nobody says much about fear at first, they play. At the beginning, the conversation is practical, prices, a rumour about hiring, a cousin who may be leaving for California. Then the cards take over. Someone makes a foolish play and gets teased. Someone wins 3 hands in a row and is accused of cheating with a smile. The coffee is terrible but hot. One person laughs harder than the joke deserves, and the others laugh because laughter, once started, can become generous. For an hour, the room does not deny the depression. It simply refuses to give it every chair at the table. That refusal is important. Escapism during the Great Depression was often an act of refusal, though not always a political one. It refused to let hardship define every minute. It refused to let poverty erase sociability. It refused to let unemployment turn people into nothing but men without jobs or women without money. It refused, in small, imperfect ways, to surrender the human need for rhythm, competition, luck, touch, laughter, suspense and play. Some escapes were healthier than others. Some exploited people. Some wasted money. Some embarrassed reformers. Some gave relief only by borrowing trouble from tomorrow. But the larger pattern is clear. Americans sought controlled worlds because the uncontrolled one had become too frightening. A dance marathon had rules. A card game had rules. Monopoly had rules. Bingo had rules. Even a chaotic amateur night had a stage, a time slot, a winner, applause or rejection. In those spaces, chance still existed. Unfairness still existed. Loss still existed, but the boundaries were visible. That alone could feel like mercy. Now the marathon hall is thinning. A few couples remain under tired lights, moving less like dancers than survivors. The audience has quieted, not because it is bored, but because the hour has grown late, and even spectacle can become solemn when the body is pushed far enough. Across town, a kitchen table is being cleared of cards. Someone counts pennies. Someone folds the game board and slides it back into a box with torn corners. A child asleep in the next room dreams of railroads and coloured money or horses or music or nothing at all. The adult stands slowly. Coats are found. A neighbour says goodnight in the hallway. Tomorrow will require the same courage as yesterday, perhaps more. But for tonight there has been movement. There has been play. There has been the clatter of dice, the scrape of chairs, the call of numbers, the shuffle of cards, the drag of tired shoes across a dance floor. There has been proof that even in a decade of waiting, Americans still found ways to do something with their hands, their feet, their luck, and their imaginations. And when the body finally stopped, when the cards were put away and the music ended, another kind of escape waited on cheap paper, folded in pockets, passed between friends, sold at newsstands, stacked in drugstores and train stations. It was the escape of ink, panels, lurid covers, detective shadows, jungle queens, rocket ships, masked men, funny pages, and stories so inexpensive that even a poor reader might sometimes afford to leave the world without leaving a chair. Cheap paper has a particular feel. It yellows quickly. It softens at the fold, it tears if you pull too hard, and if it gets damp, it does not recover well. The ink can rub onto your fingers. The cover may be brighter than anything inside your house, but the pages themselves are thin, greyish, and impatient, as if they were never meant to survive for long. That was part of the point. The magazines, comic sections, newspapers, and early comic books that carried so many Americans through the Depression were not built like treasures. They were built to be bought cheaply, read hard, passed along, folded into pockets, shared between brothers, left on streetcars, stacked in barbershops, traded by children, and finally thrown away. burned, or used for some household purpose when the story had done its work. But before they disappeared, they opened doors. There is something deeply fitting about paper escape during the Great Depression. The country was full of people who could not travel, could not move up, could not buy much, could not act freely in the ways they had imagined they might when times were good. But reading still allowed motion. A person sitting in a rented room in Cleveland could enter a jungle, a city alley, a Martian landscape, a cowboy trail, a haunted mansion, a detective's office, a pirate ship, a millionaire's study, a secret laboratory, a battlefield, a moonlit street where a masked figure knew exactly where danger was hiding. No train ticket required, no new shoes, no permission, just a few cents, or a borrowed copy, or a newspaper someone else had already finished. Let us stand for a moment at a newsstand in the mid-1930s. It might be in a city, near an elevated train, on a downtown corner, inside a drugstore, in a railroad station, or tucked beside a cigar counter. The stand is crowded with paper. Newspapers stacked thick and folded, magazines clipped upright so their covers face the passerby, movie magazines with glowing stars, detective magazines with guns and shadows, westerns with men on horses under red skies, love pulps with women looking over their shoulders at men who may or may not be trustworthy, science fiction magazines with rockets, glass helmets, strange planets, and machines no engineer had built, weird tales with monsters, ruins, sorcerers, and a sense that reality had doors no respectable person admitted existed. The covers were not subtle because they were not supposed to be. A pulp cover had to stop someone walking by with a little money and many worries. It had to say, "Here, look, this is not your life." It had to compete with hunger, fatigue, street noise, shame, advertisements, and the habit of not spending money. So the colours shouted, the titles shouted, the poses shouted, men fought on rooftops, women fainted or aimed pistols or looked terrified in elegant gowns, villains lurked in doorways, spacecraft burst through stars, cowboys fired from horseback, detectives stood under street lamps with smoke curling past their faces. The whole surface of the thing was an argument for attention. And attention, as we have been saying, was one of the great battlegrounds of the Depression. Reality wanted all of it. Bills wanted attention. Empty cupboards wanted attention. Job notices wanted attention. Dust clouds wanted attention. Factory gates wanted attention. The future, uncertain and heavy, wanted attention all the time. A pulp magazine fought back with a simple promise. "Give me an hour," it said. "Give me the bus ride. Give me the lunch break. Give me the time between supper and sleep. Give me the minutes you would otherwise spend staring at the wall. In return, I will give you danger with a beginning, middle, and end. I will give you villains who can be found. I will give you heroes who act. I will give you a world where someone knows what to do." That last promise was powerful. During the Depression, so many people did not know what to do because there was often nothing useful they could do. A man could walk all day looking for work and find none. A farmer could plant and watch the sky refuse rain. A mother could stretch the food but not create abundance from nothing. A bank depositor could stand outside a closed bank and wait for answers that might never restore what had been lost. But in cheap fiction, someone always did something. Detectives followed clues. Cowboys rode out. Aviators took off. Spies slipped through enemy lines. Adventurers entered forbidden cities. Scientists built machines. Masked Avengers stepped from the shadows. Action was everywhere, and in a decade of stalled lives, action itself became a kind of luxury. The pulp magazines got their name from the cheap wood pulp paper on which they were printed. They were descendants of dime novels, story papers, and earlier forms of mass-market fiction. But by the 1920s and 1930s, they had become a vast popular industry. They covered almost every appetite. There were detective pulps, western pulps, adventure pulps, aviation pulps, romance pulps, sports pulps, Horror pulps, science fiction pulps, spicy pulps, hero pulps, railroad stories, sea stories, jungle stories, war stories, and mixtures of all of them. They were not respectable literature in the eyes of many critics, and they were not trying to be. They were fast, direct, crowded with plot, and built for readers who wanted momentum. The detective pulps are especially revealing. Magazines like Black Mask helped shape the hard-boiled style, a world of private eyes, corrupt cities, gangsters, crooked officials, bruised knuckles, cheap offices, and moral codes that survived in dirty places. That kind of fiction was not an escape into softness. It was an escape into toughness. Readers did not always want a clean world. Sometimes they wanted a world as corrupt as the one they suspected they lived in, but with one crucial difference. In the story, a man with nerve and persistence could push through the corruption and expose something. The detective might be tired, broke, cynical, and in danger, but he moved. He followed the trail. He took the punch and stood up again. That was not nothing. Think about what a private detective represented to a depression reader. He was usually not rich. He did not belong fully to the respectable upper world. He dealt with landlords, cops, criminals, clients who lied, women in trouble, men with money, men without morals, and cities that did not reward innocence. He lived close enough to ordinary hardship to feel recognizable, but he had an independence most readers lacked. He could walk into rooms where others were excluded. He could ask questions. He could refuse to be impressed. He could see through polished surfaces. In a decade when many Americans felt pushed around by systems too large to confront, that kind of figure had obvious appeal. The Westerns offered a different kind of order. The Depression was modern in its causes: finance, industry, banks, global markets, mechanized agriculture, credit, policy, speculation, and collapse. The Western returned readers to a landscape where conflict seemed older and cleaner. Land, cattle, horses, fences, outlaws, sheriffs, a man's word, a gunfight at noon, or at least a confrontation clear enough to understand. Of course, the historical West had never been as simple as the magazines made it. Real frontier history included dispossession, racial violence, labour conflict, environmental hardship, failed dreams, and many forms of injustice. But the pulp Western was not primarily selling history. It was selling moral visibility. A reader could tell who had stolen the cattle. A rider could cross distance. A wrong could be avenged. The horizon remained open, even when the reader's own horizon had shrunk to a room, a street, or a relief office. Science fiction and fantasy did something even more daring. They did not simply return readers to an imagined past. They launched them out of the present altogether. Magazines like Amazing Stories, Astounding Stories, and others carried readers into futures of rockets, alien worlds, strange machines, time travel, mad science, and cosmic danger. The science was often loose, the prose sometimes clumsy, the covers sensational, but the emotional function was clear. At a time when the present felt trapped, science fiction insisted that tomorrow existed. Not just tomorrow morning, with the same worries waiting, but a huge tomorrow, full of inventions, civilizations, planets, disasters, triumphs, and possibilities so large that the Depression became, if not small, then at least not the final measure of human life. That kind of future mattered. The 1930s were filled with both despair and technological wonder. Airplanes had become symbols of modern speed. Radio had collapsed distance. Automobiles had changed movement, even when many could no longer afford to drive as they once had. Skyscrapers had risen just as the economy fell. The same society that produced bread lines also produced visions of streamlined trains, electric kitchens, rockets, robots, and cities of tomorrow. Science fiction pulps fed on that contradiction. They said, yes, The present is broken, but the future is still roaring somewhere ahead. For young readers especially, these stories could be formative. A boy in a crowded apartment or on a failing farm might read about space travel and feel his mind lift beyond the county line. A girl might read adventure or romance and imagine forms of courage, danger, beauty, or independence not available in her daily life. Not every story gave girls much to work with. Many pulps repeated narrow roles and cheap stereotypes. But readers are resourceful. They take what they need, even from imperfect material. A brave heroine on one cover, a woman pilot in one story, a clever secretary who sees what men miss, a queen of a lost civilization. Even these exaggerated figures could leave traces in the imagination. Then there were the hero pulps, perhaps the closest relatives of the superheroes who were about to arrive in comic books. The Shadow, with his dark cloak, hidden identity, and ability to terrify criminals, became one of the great popular figures of the era, appearing in pulp magazines and on radio. Doc Savage, introduced in the 1930s, offered another fantasy. The perfect man. Brilliant, strong, disciplined, wealthy, scientific, surrounded by a team, travelling the world to defeat threats ordinary institutions could not handle. These characters were not realistic, and that was precisely their advantage. They gave readers competence at a superhuman scale. Competence was one of the Great Depression fantasies. Not wealth alone, though wealth mattered. Not violence alone, though danger sold. Competence. The fantasy that someone somewhere had trained enough, prepared enough, learned enough, and gathered enough resources to meet any crisis. In real life, experts had failed. Bankers had failed. Politicians had failed. Employers had failed. Markets had failed. But Doc Savage would have a plan. The Shadow would know. The masked avenger would appear at the right moment. That idea could be childish, yes, but childhood is not the only stage of life that needs rescuers. Comic strips carried escape in a more regular and communal way. They arrived with the newspaper, often daily, and especially in the Sunday funnies, where colour pages became a weekly treat for millions of households. Unlike a pulp magazine, which a person might buy occasionally, comic strips became part of domestic routine. They were read at breakfast, on streetcars, after work, on the floor by children, over someone's shoulder, clipped, saved, argued over, and quoted. The newspaper might bring grim headlines on the front page, but tucked inside or spread across the Sunday section were worlds that returned again and again. Little Orphan Annie is one of the clearest examples. Created in the 1920s and enormously popular by the 1930s, Annie presented a tough, independent child navigating danger, poverty, villains, and changing fortune with stubborn optimism. Daddy Warbucks, with his immense wealth and power, added another depression fantasy. The benevolent rich man who might intervene, protect, and set things right. That fantasy had obvious emotional weight in a decade when many people felt abandoned by real wealth and real power. Annie herself, though, was not passive. She endured. She travelled. She spoke her mind. She was a child, but she did not collapse. For young readers living with adult worry, that mattered. Dick Tracy, introduced in 1931, gave readers a clean-lined war against crime. The strip's villains were often grotesque, memorable, almost symbolic in their physical features and names. Tracy pursued them with relentless determination. The world of the strip was violent and dangerous, but justice had a square jaw and did not tire easily. In the early 1930s, when real gangsters, kidnappings, bank robberies, and public anxieties about crime-filled newspapers, a detective strip could turn fear into sequence. Crime happened. Tracy investigated. The net tightened. The villain fell. Again, reality was not denied. It was reorganised. Popeye, who had appeared at the end of the 1920s, became a Depression-era favourite too, and his appeal is not hard to understand. He was not elegant. He was not polished. he was not rich. He had one eye, odd speech, a rough body, an enormous stubbornness, and a moral simplicity that made him oddly lovable. Popeye's strength was exaggerated, comic, and usually unlocked through spinach, but the deeper pleasure lay in his refusal to be defeated by anyone more refined, bigger, louder, or more arrogant. He looked like someone from the margins who could still win. In a decade when refinement offered little protection, that was a satisfying thing to watch. Blondie, which began in 1930, eventually became one of the great domestic comic strips, especially after Blondie and Dagwood married. The strip shifted into a world of household mishaps, work frustrations, food, marriage, children, neighbours, bosses, and the small absurdities of middle-class life. That kind of comedy was its own escape because it made ordinary domestic irritation safe. A sandwich could become an event. A late arrival to work could become a running joke. A boss could be feared and mocked. In times of serious trouble, small domestic comedy can be a relief precisely because the stakes are not foreclosure or hunger, but Dagwood oversleeping again. Adventure strips like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon offered vast visual escapes. Buck Rogers, appearing at the end of the 1920s, carried readers into the 25th century with ray guns, airships, strange cities, and future wars. Flash Gordon, beginning in 1934, brought a lush, exotic space opera style to newspaper pages with planets, tyrants, princesses, monsters, and heroes in motion. The art itself mattered. A child could stare at those panels long after reading the words. The newspaper became a window not just into story but into design, costume, architecture, machinery, and worlds no budget could build in real life. Sunday comics had a special place because Sunday itself had a different rhythm. Even in hard times, Sunday might allow a little more lingering. The paper could be spread across the floor. Children could claim the funny pages before adults finished the serious sections. In homes where toys were few, the Sunday comics became an object of desire. Bright colour, recurring characters, jokes, cliffhangers, and the pleasure of knowing that next week there would be more. That continuity was important. Like radio serials, comic strips promised return. The story did not fix life, but it came back reliably. In an unreliable decade, reliable small pleasures became important. I want to imagine a boy in 1935 lying on his stomach on the floor, elbows planted, chin in his hands, reading the comics. The floor is not especially comfortable. The room is not especially warm. His parents are talking quietly in the kitchen, and although he's not supposed to listen, he has learned the tones of money trouble. He reads anyway. In one strip, a detective closes in on a criminal. In another, a sailor punches someone through a wall. In another, a child refuses to be frightened. In another, a rocket ship crosses space. The boy does not have the words to say that he is using these panels as shelter. He only knows he does not want to stop. A girl in another house might be reading a movie magazine, studying photographs of stars, hairstyles, dresses, faces arranged for glamour. Or she might read a romance pulp, or the advice columns, or a comic strip heroine, or the serialized fiction in a newspaper. She understands very well that her own life does not look like those pictures. The dress in the magazine may be impossible. The romance may be absurd. The star's skin, lighting, and smile may belong to a manufactured world. But reading lets her test possible selves. How would it feel to walk into a room that way? How would it feel to be admired? How would it feel to leave town? How would it feel to speak boldly? Imagination is not the same as opportunity, but it can keep the desire for opportunity alive. Magazines also created communities of taste. Readers wrote letters, fans argued, children traded issues, adults discussed serials, barbershops, waiting rooms, boarding houses, railroad stations and drugstores became places where magazines circulated beyond the original buyer. A pulp bought by one person might be read by 5 or 10. Pages were not private in the way a diary is private. They moved. That movement mattered in poor communities because scarcity made sharing normal. A boy finished a magazine and passed it to a friend. A neighbour handed over a stack of old newspapers. A family saved Sunday sections for younger cousins. Escape became second-hand, third-hand, frayed at the corners, still useful. Libraries deserve a place here too, because not all reading escape came through buying. Public libraries during the Depression provided warmth, quiet, newspapers, books, and a place to be that did not require spending money. For unemployed men, libraries could be places to read job listings, newspapers, or simply sit indoors without being moved along. For children, libraries offered shelves of worlds beyond what a family could purchase. Librarians sometimes worried about lowbrow reading, about children wanting adventure stories rather than improving books, about adults reading detective fiction instead of serious literature. But the line between improvement and escape is not always as clear as reformers think. A tired person may need escape before they can bear improvement. The cheapness of paper also shaped its disposability, and that disposability is one reason so much of this culture was later underestimated. Fine books are saved. Family Bibles are saved. Legal papers are saved. Expensive photographs are saved. Pulp magazines were used up. Comic sections were thrown away. Early comic books were read to pieces. That means the very materials that mattered to ordinary people often left the faintest trace. Historians have to work against the habits of preservation, because the past tends to save what wealth respected, and lose what children loved on the floor. And now we come to the comic book itself. In the early 1930s, comic books were still finding their form, often reprinting newspaper strips. But by the later 1930s, original comic books began creating a new kind of cheap paper hero, and in 1938, Superman appeared in Action Comics. It is hard to overstate how perfectly timed that arrival was. Here was a figure who looked human, but was more than human. An alien raised in America, a champion of the oppressed, a man who could not be harmed by ordinary weapons, who could leap over buildings, lift cars, smash through barriers, and defend people who had no power of their own. His earlier stories were rougher, more socially charged, and more direct than some later versions would become. He went after wife-beaters, corrupt businessmen, dangerous mine owners, and men who abused power. He was fantasy, yes, but not empty fantasy. He was a fantasy of intervention. In 1938, Americans did not need to be told what powerlessness felt like. They knew. A hero who could grab a car, crash through a wall, and force a corrupt man to listen was more than a children's amusement. He was an answer to a question many people carried silently. What would justice look like if it were not delayed, compromised, underfunded, or bought off? Superman answered with speed. He did not fill out forms. He did not wait for permission. He arrived. For children especially, that must have been intoxicating. Batman followed in 1939, darker, urban, born from crime and fear, rather than bright invulnerability. Though he belongs more to the edge of the Depression and the coming war years, his arrival also made sense in a world fascinated by crime, detectives, shadows, and masked justice. Together, these early superheroes drew from pulps, radio, newspaper strips, myth, circus strongmen, detective fiction, science fiction, and the emotional demands of an anxious public. They were not separate from Depression culture. They were one of its late answers. But let us not make the mistake of thinking only children read this material. Adults read pulps, comics, strips, magazines, and newspapers constantly. A man on a lunch break might read a western. A woman resting after housework might read a romance or confession magazine. A clerk might follow Dick Tracy. A factory worker might read The Shadow. A farmer might keep old magazines in a stack by a chair. Reading was portable, private, and flexible. You could do it in fragments. You could stop when called. You could return later. You could read aloud to someone else. You could hide what you read if embarrassed. You could reread when there was nothing new. There was criticism, of course. Teachers, ministers, librarians, parents, and moral authorities worried that pulps and comics were cheapening minds, encouraging crime, stirring up improper fantasies, wasting time, or distracting from better literature. Some of those worries were sincere. Some were class prejudice dressed up as cultural concern. Popular reading has always frightened people who believe the public cannot be trusted with its own pleasures. And to be fair, plenty of pulp material was crude, sexist, racist, violent, formulaic, or sensational. The escape it offered was not always admirable. But human needs do not wait for perfect art. People used what was available. For black readers, immigrant readers, working class readers, and others pushed to the margins of mainstream American life, cheap paper could offer both escape and insult. Many pulps and comics trafficked in racial stereotypes, exoticism, and casual prejudice. At the same time, black newspapers, ethnic presses, labour papers, religious publications, and community magazines provided alternative reading worlds where people could see their own concerns, humour, politics, achievements, and struggles addressed more directly. The Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and other black newspapers, for example, were not escapist in the same simple sense, but they provided connection, pride, information, and a wider horizon. Sometimes reality-based reading can be its own escape from isolation, because it tells you that your community exists beyond the block you can see. This is worth remembering. Escape does not always mean fantasy. Sometimes it means recognition. A person can escape loneliness by reading about people like themselves. They can escape the narrowness imposed by local prejudice by seeing a larger community in print. They can escape the lie that their suffering is private by reading that others are fighting, organising, creating, laughing, surviving. For many Americans in the Depression, print culture did both things. It took them away from reality, and it told them they were not alone inside it. Now imagine the end of an evening. The radio has gone quiet. The cards are put away. Someone in the house still has a pulp magazine open under a weak lamp. The cover promised gunfire or romance or outer space. But now the reader is deep enough inside the story that the cover no longer matters. The paper is rough against the thumb. The print is small. The room is dark beyond the circle of light. Outside, the country is still in trouble. Men will still line up tomorrow. A farm will still be sold somewhere. A factory will still not call back. A mother will still calculate breakfast before sleep. But for these few pages, there is a trail to follow. The hero enters the warehouse. The detective notices the clue. The spaceship door opens. The cowboy sees dust rising beyond the ridge. The orphan girl refuses to be afraid. The sailor eats his spinach. The masked man waits in the shadow. The next panel, the next paragraph, the next page pulls the reader forward. And forward is the thing. Forward is what the Depression had taken from so many lives. Cheap paper gave it back in miniature. The lamp burns low. The reader turns one more page. Maybe they promise themselves it will be the last one. Maybe they know perfectly well it will not. In another house, a child has hidden the Sunday comics under a pillow. In another, a young man folds a pulp and slips it into his coat for tomorrow's wait outside the hiring office. In another, a woman tears a picture from a magazine because the dress is beautiful, not because she can own it, but because beauty on paper costs nothing once the magazine is already there. Across the country, these fragile pages move from hand to hand, carrying impossible people through impossible plots, and somehow helping real people endure real days. And while those pages were being folded, traded, and read down to softness, another set of heroes was waiting outside the world of print. They were not drawn in panels or described in lurid prose. They stood in ballparks, boxing rings, stadiums, and newspaper photographs. They had bodies that could fail in public, records that could be counted, victories that could be argued over in barbershops and kitchens, in a time when so many Americans felt beaten by forces too large to see. The sight of someone swinging a bat, throwing a punch, rounding a base, or refusing to stay down gave people a different kind of story to hold on to. A sports hero in the 1930s was not an escape, because his life was easy. That is the first thing to understand. The people who filled ballparks, crowded around radios, read box scores, argued over batting averages, followed prize fights, and saved newspaper clippings were not looking only for men who lived above hardship. Sometimes they were looking for men who made hardship visible and then did something inside it. A batter standing alone at the plate, a pitcher staring in from the mound, a boxer rising from a knockdown, a runner rounding third with the crowd already on its feet. These were simple scenes, almost too simple when compared with the enormous problems of the Depression, but that simplicity was exactly why they mattered. The Depression was complicated in a way that exhausted ordinary people. A bank could fail for reasons no depositor fully understood. A factory could close because of decisions made by men no worker would ever meet. Crop prices could collapse because of markets, weather, debt, overproduction, and forces that seemed to move like machinery behind a wall. But baseball and boxing gave Americans conflicts they could see. The ball was thrown, the bat missed or connected, the bell rang, the punch landed or did not. The umpire called safe or out, the referee counted. A crowd might disagree loudly, but the event itself had shape. It began, it unfolded, and it ended. There is comfort in a contest that ends. That may sound strange, but during the Great Depression, many struggles did not end cleanly. Looking for work did not end with a final score. It simply continued. Debt did not end when you were tired of thinking about it. Hunger did not end because a mother had done her best. Shame did not end because a man had walked enough miles in one day. A baseball game, though, ended after 9 innings, unless it went into extras, and even then people understood the terms. A prize fight ended after a set number of rounds, or when one man could not continue. The uncertainty was real, but it was bounded. For a few hours, Americans could give themselves to suspense that promised release. Let us begin in a ballpark, because baseball had already become one of the great shared languages of American life by the time the Depression arrived. Picture a city afternoon in the early 1930s. The streets outside the stadium are not carefree. They are full of men who may have had no work that week, boys who have learned not to ask for too much, vendors trying to sell what they can, and fans who have chosen carefully to spend coins on a ticket. Not everyone could afford to go. Attendance fell in many places during the worst years because people had less money, and professional baseball, like almost everything else, felt the crisis. But the game did not disappear. It could not. It had already become too deeply woven into the habits of summer. The ballpark offered a particular kind of escape because it was both ordinary and ceremonial. You walked through a gate, found a seat, smelled dust, tobacco, hot dogs, peanuts, sun-warmed wood, and the faint green smell of the field if you were close enough. The seats were not always comfortable. The crowd was not always polite. The bathrooms were not elegant. But the field opened in front of you with its familiar geometry, and that geometry itself was calming. The diamond, the foul lines, the bases, the outfield wall, the scoreboard. A person could look at that field and know where everything belonged. During the Depression, knowing where things belonged could feel like a luxury. A man who had spent the morning being told no at a hiring office could sit in the cheap seats and know the count. 2 balls, 1 strike. A boy whose family had moved twice in a year could know that first base was still first base. A woman who followed the game through the newspaper or radio could know that a batting average meant something, that a streak could be counted, that a season had order even when a household budget did not. Baseball turned time into innings, months into standings, effort into statistics, disappointment into tomorrow's game. That kind of structure was not trivial. It gave people a way to talk about failure and hope without saying the heavier words. The box score was part of the ritual. In the morning paper, a fan could study yesterday's game in miniature. Hits, runs, errors, innings pitched, strikeouts, names arranged in columns. To someone uninterested in baseball, it looks dry. To a fan, it is a little machine for recreating the game. A father at breakfast could read the numbers and explain to a child what happened. Men in barbershops and on street corners could argue about whether a manager should have pulled a pitcher. Workers on lunch breaks could fold the sports page and carry it in a pocket. The box score made a game portable. In a decade when so much seemed to vanish, the record remained. Radio changed baseball's emotional reach. Not everyone could enter the stadium, but a broadcast could carry the game into kitchens, stores, porches, garages and bedrooms. A radio announcer did something almost magical for a listener. He turned absence into vision. He described the pitch, the swing, the ball lifting, the runner moving, the crowd rising. The listener saw nothing, yet saw everything. For families who could not spare ticket money, radio baseball offered the ballpark without the gate. It made a summer afternoon communal even for those sitting far from the field. Imagine a man listening on a porch in 1934. He has not had steady work in months. His shoes are polished because he still goes out looking as if appearance can hold dignity in place. His son sits beside him. The game comes through the radio with occasional static. The announcer's voice quickens, then settles, then quickens again. The father explains a sacrifice bunt. The boy asks why the runner did not go. For a few innings, the father is not only an unemployed man, he is someone who knows the game. He has expertise. He can teach. The boy listens to him with respect. That small restoration of authority matters more than it looks from outside. Baseball heroes in the Depression carried different meanings depending on who was watching. Babe Ruth was already a legend by the early 1930s, larger than life in a way that fit the older booming America of the 1920s. His great home run years had come before the worst of the Depression, but his presence lingered. Ruth represented abundance, appetite, showmanship, noise, an impossible power. He swung as if limits were offensive to him. Even as his career moved toward its end, he remained a symbol of a freer, bigger, less cautious America. Fans remembered the ball leaving the park, the big body moving around the bases, the grin, the excess. In hungry years, even the memory of excess had force. Lou Gehrig offered almost the opposite kind of heroism. Where Ruth was flamboyant, Gehrig seemed steady. He was the iron horse, known for showing up day after day, playing through pain, doing the work, producing without theatrical display. His consecutive games streak became more than a sports record. In the Depression, showing up had moral weight. People respected endurance because they were practicing it themselves. Gehrig's reliability felt like a public virtue. He did not need to appear invulnerable in the loud way Ruth did. His power was repetition. He came to work. He stood at first base. He took his turn. He did it again. That is why his decline at the end of the decade struck people so deeply. When Gehrig removed himself from the lineup in 1939, ending the streak, and then gave his famous farewell speech after being diagnosed with the disease that would later carry his name, the moment landed far beyond baseball. It was not simply that a great player was ill, it was that one of the era's symbols of endurance had been forced to stop. Americans who had admired him for never giving in saw him face the one opponent no discipline could defeat. His statement that he considered himself lucky has been repeated so often that it can sound almost polished by history, but in its moment it was startling. A man losing his strength in public spoke with gratitude. That kind of courage was not an escape from reality. It was a way of standing inside it. By the mid and late 1930s, Joe DiMaggio was rising as another baseball figure, elegant, controlled, and graceful in a different way. His major career would stretch beyond the Depression into the war years and after, but his arrival in 1936 gave Yankees fans and newspaper readers a new kind of modern hero. DiMaggio seemed smooth, almost reserved, a player whose movements looked clean even under pressure. For Italian-American communities especially, his success carried ethnic pride at a time when immigrant families and their children were still negotiating belonging in American life. Sports could do that. It could make a name familiar to people who might otherwise dismiss it. It could let a community see one of its own applauded in public. But any honest history of American sports in the 1930s has to look beyond the major leagues as white newspapers presented them. Black Americans loved baseball too, and some of the greatest players in the world were playing in the Negro Leagues because Major League Baseball remained segregated. Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, Buck Leonard and many others played before crowds that understood exactly how much talent was being kept outside the official white Major League structure. Their games were not secondary in skill or meaning. They were central to black sporting culture, community pride and entertainment during a decade that pressed especially hard on black workers and families who faced the depression on top of segregation, discrimination and exclusion from many opportunities. A Negro League game could be a social event, a display of excellence, and a form of collective pride. The stands held families, workers, church people, young fans, gamblers, musicians, travellers, and local personalities. The play could be brilliant, fast, inventive, and theatrical. Satchel Paige became famous not only for his pitching, but for his showmanship, his confidence, his wit, his ability to turn a game into an event before the ball ever left his hand. Josh Gibson's power became the stuff of stories, and stories themselves mattered because official recognition was denied. When a system refuses to keep your records properly, memory becomes a kind of archive. Fans carried these players in conversation, in newspapers, in community legend. For black Americans during the Depression, sports heroes could offer something different from the escapes available to white audiences. They offered proof of excellence in a country determined to limit where that excellence could be displayed. That proof mattered. A black child watching Satchel Paige strike out batters did not need a lecture about dignity. It was there on the mound. A crowd cheering a Negro League star was not merely escaping hardship. It was affirming a world of talent, style, humour and achievement that segregation tried to diminish. At the same time, the injustice remained. Escape and anger could sit side by side in the same bleachers. Boxing, though, may have been the Depression sport that most directly matched the emotional life of the decade. Baseball is long, seasonal, patient. Boxing is immediate. Two men in a ring, stripped down to bodies, skill, fear and endurance. No bat, no glove in the baseball sense, no teammates to hide behind, no fielders to blame. The bell rings, and the body must answer. That simplicity made boxing extraordinarily powerful in hard times. A fight was not metaphorical in any complicated way. Someone was going to be hit. Someone might fall. The question was whether he could get up. During the Depression, Americans knew something about getting up. Prize fighting had long carried class associations. Many fighters came from poor or working-class backgrounds, immigrant neighbourhoods, black communities, ethnic enclaves, mining towns, farms and city streets, where physical toughness was not abstract. Boxing promised one of the few dramatic routes from poverty to fame, though it was dangerous and often exploitative. Managers, promoters, gamblers and sports writers all fed on fighters. A boxer's body was his capital, and every bout spent some of it. That made boxing both inspiring and brutal. Fans admired courage, but they were also watching men damage one another for money. The Depression did not create that contradiction. It made it sharper. The story of James J. Braddock, later remembered as the Cinderella Man, became one of the clearest Depression sports myths because it followed the shape people wanted desperately to believe in. Braddock had been a contender, then declined, suffered injuries, lost money, and ended up on relief, working when he could. Then, unexpectedly, he returned to boxing success, and in 1935 defeated Max Baer to become heavyweight champion. The facts matter, but the emotional pattern mattered more. A man falls, a man is counted out by the world. A man takes work where he can find it. A man comes back. In a decade of fallen men, that story was irresistible. Imagine listening to that fight on the radio, or reading about it in the next day's paper. Braddock was not young in the way rising sports heroes are usually young. He was not untouched by hardship. He had known humiliation. He had stood in relief lines. He had taken blows outside the ring too. When he won, fans did not simply see an athletic upset. They saw a fantasy of reversal that did not feel completely ridiculous because it had happened to a real man. If Braddock could come back, maybe comeback itself had not disappeared from American life. Max Baer, whom Braddock defeated, was a complicated figure in public imagination. Charismatic, powerful, sometimes treated by the press as careless or clowning. Baer had beaten Primo Carnera for the title in 1934 and entered the Braddock fight as the expected stronger man. Boxing narratives often simplify fighters into types because audiences like moral clarity, the dangerous champion, the humble challenger, the puncher, the craftsman, the villain, the underdog. Reality is always more complicated than the roles assigned. But in Depression sports culture, the underdog role had special force because so many Americans felt they were living inside it. And then came Joe Louis. Joe Louis became one of the most important American athletes of the 1930s, not only because he was a great boxer, though he was, but because his career carried meanings far beyond the ring. Born in Alabama, raised in Detroit, Louis emerged as a heavyweight contender in the mid-1930s with a style that seemed controlled, devastating, and calm. He was powerful without seeming reckless, disciplined in public, and managed carefully in a racist country that scrutinized black athletes with particular cruelty. The memory of Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, still haunted white boxing authorities and sports writers, many of whom had reacted to Johnson's confidence, wealth, and public defiance with open racism. Lewis's handlers understood this history and shaped his public image accordingly. He was presented as modest, restrained, hard-working, non-threatening outside the ring, overwhelming inside it. This was unfair in the way public burdens placed on black figures in racist societies are always unfair. Louis had to carry not only his opponents, but the expectations and fears projected onto him. Yet black America saw in him something immense. Here was a black man who could stand before the entire country and win under rules everyone could see. When Louis fought, black communities gathered around radios in homes, bars, clubs, streets and public places. The fight broadcast became a collective event. Every punch carried more than sport. Every victory answered something. Not everything, not nearly enough, but something. His 1936 loss to Max Schmeling of Germany shocked the boxing world. Schmeling was not yet the symbol he would become 2 years later in American public imagination. But the loss mattered deeply because Louis had seemed almost unstoppable. He was knocked down and defeated. For fans who had invested hope in him, especially black fans, the defeat hurt. But the rematch in 1938 became one of the most charged sporting events in American history. By then, Nazi Germany had become impossible to ignore. Schmeling, who was personally more complicated than propaganda allowed, was used by the Nazi regime as a symbol of Aryan superiority. Louis, a black American in a segregated country that denied him full equality, became the fighter many white Americans also rallied behind as a representative of the United States against fascism. The irony is impossible to miss. A nation that segregated schools, neighborhoods, theaters, jobs, and even military service looked to a black boxer as a national champion. For black Americans, this irony was not abstract. They lived it. They could cheer Louis and still know that victory over a German opponent would not end Jim Crow. Yet the night of June 22nd, 1938, when Louis destroyed Schmeling in the first round at Yankee Stadium, mattered profoundly. The fight lasted just over 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was all the time needed for months of anticipation to explode into relief. Imagine the listening rooms that night. Radios turned up. People packed into apartments, clubs, barbershops, restaurants, streets where a set had been placed near a window. Children told to be quiet. Adults leaning forward. The announcer's voice rising. Louis attacking. Schmeling hurt. Knockdowns. Confusion. Then, the end. For many black listeners, celebration erupted not only because a boxer had won, but because humiliation had been refused on a global stage. For many white listeners, Louis had become an American answer to Nazi claims, though not all were willing to face what his victory said about racism at home. Sports allowed a national unity for a moment, but the unity was incomplete and often hypocritical. Still, the emotion of the night was real. That is one of the things sports does. It creates real feeling from imperfect circumstances. The crowd may be segregated, the industry may be exploitative, the newspapers may be biased, the promoters may be greedy, the politics may be tangled, and still a punch lands, a runner scores, a crowd roars, and people feel something together that they could not have felt alone. Boxing nights were especially suited to radio. A fight broadcast could turn a room into a ring. The listener did not see the sweat, the footwork, the swelling, the feints, the small adjustments, but the announcer's urgency supplied the missing picture. People imagined the ring from voice alone. They saw Lewis's combinations, Braddock's persistence, Bear's power, Schmeling's fall, not through eyes but through sound. The pauses were agony. A sudden shout could make everyone in the room stand. If the signal faded at the wrong moment, panic broke out. Someone hit the side of the radio as if violence might improve reception. In a decade of helplessness, even adjusting the dial during a fight felt like participation. There were other sporting heroes too, because the 1930s were hungry for figures who could carry public emotion. Seabiscuit, the small, ungainly racehorse who became a national sensation later in the decade, belonged to this world of underdog belief. He was not baseball or boxing, but he moved through the same emotional landscape. A horse considered unimpressive becomes a champion, a jockey with injuries, a trainer with patience, an owner with money, but also a story, a public desperate for comeback narratives. When Seabiscuit raced War Admiral in 1938, millions followed it through radio and newspapers. The appeal was obvious. A nation full of people told they were finished watched a horse prove that being overlooked was not the same as being beaten. Babe Didrikson, one of the greatest athletes of the era, also deserves to be remembered here. She excelled in track and field, golf, basketball and more, winning Olympic medals in 1932 and challenging conventional ideas about women's athletic ability. During a decade when many women were expected to sacrifice ambition to family need or social judgment, Didrikson's public athletic dominance offered a different image of female capability. She was not always treated fairly by the press, which often framed strong women athletes through discomfort, fascination or ridicule. But she refused smallness. That refusal mattered. Still, baseball and boxing remained especially central because they fit American storytelling so well. Baseball turned time into a season and made failure survivable because even great hitters failed often. Boxing turned courage into a body standing under lights. Both offered heroes who could be discussed endlessly, and discussion was part of the escape. Americans did not only watch or listen, they argued. Who was the best hitter? Could Gehrig keep going? Was Ruth finished? Could Louis beat Schmeling this time? Was Braddock lucky or great? Did the referee count too fast? Would the Yankees win again? These arguments filled barbershops, lunch counters, stoops, factory floors, relief lines, pool halls and kitchens. They gave people something to say besides bad news. That may sound small, but conversation topics matter in hard times. If every conversation turns toward fear, people begin to avoid one another. Sports gave men especially, though certainly not only men, a way to remain social without confessing vulnerability. A man might not say, "I am terrified, I will never work again." He could say, "Did you hear Louis last night?" He might not say, "I feel useless at home." He could explain why the manager made the wrong decision in the seventh. Sports talk allowed emotion to move sideways. Hope, anger, admiration, disappointment, pride, and grief could all enter the room wearing a team cap or boxing headline. Children collected heroes differently. A boy might memorize batting averages, copy a batting stance with a stick in an alley, pretend to be Lou Gehrig or Joe DiMaggio or a local Negro League star his family admired. A girl might follow teams too, though later memory often underestimates how many women and girls loved sports. Families attended games together when they could. Women read sports pages, listened to broadcasts, and formed attachments to players. Sports culture was male-dominated in its institutions, but not exclusively male in its audience. The thrill of seeing someone excel belongs to no single gender. In poor neighbourhoods, children made versions of professional sport out of whatever they had. A taped ball, a broomstick bat, a chalk strike zone on a wall, a vacant lot with broken glass cleared to the edges, bases made from cardboard, stones, coats, or memory. These games were not only imitation, they were training in hope. Every child who swung at a makeshift ball entered the larger story for a second. The stadium might be far away, the ticket unaffordable, the hero unreachable, but the motion could be copied. Swing, run, slide, argue, do it again. Sports also offered meritocracy as a dream, though not always as reality. Fans liked to believe that on the field or in the ring, performance mattered more than background. Hit the ball and you are valuable. Knock out the opponent and you win. But reality was more constrained. Race-barred black baseball players from the majors. Class-shaped access to training. Ethnicity affected coverage. Women athletes faced ridicule and limited opportunities. Boxing could exploit poor fighters. Still, compared with the closed doors of the Depression economy, sports appear to offer a clearer path from ability to recognition. Even when that appearance was incomplete, it had emotional power. Let us picture a fight night in a working-class neighbourhood. The radio is set in the window of a barbershop so people outside can hear. The sidewalk fills, men in hats, boys squeezing between adults, women standing near doorways, someone holding a child who should be in bed. The air is warm. Cigarette smoke moves in the light. The announcer's voice crackles. Every few seconds, someone repeats the action for those farther back. He got him. No, wait, listen, quiet. Then a roar from the speaker, and the whole sidewalk reacts as if the ring were 10 feet away. Strangers grab each other's arms. Someone curses. Someone laughs. Someone begins praying under his breath. When the fight ends, the crowd becomes a single body for a moment. Now picture a ball game on the radio in a rural store. A few farmers have come in for supplies they buy carefully or on credit. The owner lets the game play because it keeps people there and because he wants to hear it too. A boy sits on a crate. A man who has lost money on crops leans against the counter. Someone spits tobacco into a can. The announcer describes a long fly ball and everyone waits through the half second between description and outcome. Caught at the wall, groans, then argument. Should have swung earlier. Bad pitch to go after. He'll get him next time. The game gives the room weather that is not drought, economics that is not debt, disappointment that does not require foreclosure. This is the emotional genius of sports in the Depression. It did not ask people to forget struggle. It translated struggle into forms they could bear. Slump, comeback, knock down, rally, losing streak, extra innings, underdog, champion. These words moved easily between sport and life because they belonged to both. A team could be down and still rally. A fighter could be hurt and still win. A player could fail 3 times and come through on the 4th. No responsible adult believed that life always worked that way, but it helped to see it happen somewhere. There is also a particular relief in watching someone else be excellent. During the Depression, many people were prevented from being excellent at anything visible. A skilled worker without a job cannot display his skill. A careful homemaker with too little food cannot make abundance appear. A farmer without rain cannot produce a good crop through discipline alone. The economy interrupted competence. Sports restored the public display of competence. A great athlete made mastery visible. The swing, the pitch, the jab, the footwork, the timing, the control. Watching that could be almost nourishing. It reminded people that human ability had not vanished simply because the economy had failed. And heroes could disappoint, of course. They lost. They aged. They were flawed. They were used by promoters, owners, newspapers, and political narratives. Some behaved badly. Some were reduced to symbols too simple for their real lives. But the public did not need them to be perfect in order to need them. In fact, the flaws often made them more usable. A perfect hero belongs to marble. A struggling hero belongs to people. As the 1930s moved forward, sports became more than games. They became national reference points. Roosevelt's speeches might explain policy. Movies might offer glamour. Radio dramas might offer story, but sports offered proof under pressure. Not proof that America was fair, because it was not. Not proof that effort always wins, because it does not. But proof that courage, skill, endurance, and timing still existed and could still draw a crowd. The stadium empties slowly after the game. Paper cups and peanut shells are left under seats. A boy walks home swinging an invisible bat. His father lets him talk because the talk is better than the silence they might otherwise share. In another city, a radio is being turned off after a fight, and the room is still buzzing with what everyone just heard. In a black neighbourhood, Joe Louis's victory is repeated in doorways and barbershops and church steps until the details become polished by joy. On a farm, a man folds the sports page and saves it, not because paper is rare exactly, but because that particular account feels worth keeping. Tomorrow, the hard things return. The factory gate, the relief office, the field, the unpaid rent, the closed bank, the long walk. But tonight, someone won. Someone stood in. Someone took the count and rose. Someone swung and connected. Someone carried the hopes of strangers for a few innings or a few rounds and did not drop them. That did not fix the Depression, but it gave Americans a language for surviving it. And as the decade went on, another kind of promise began to glow on the horizon, not from a ballpark or boxing ring, but from fairgrounds, highways, exhibitions, and strange roadside places where Americans went to see the future laid out before them. If sports gave them heroes to believe in, the fairs and wonders of the 1930s offered something even more daring. They asked people to believe that tomorrow itself might still be worth visiting. By the middle of the 1930s, hope had become something Americans wanted to see with their own eyes. Not only hear about in a speech, not only read about in a newspaper column. Not only imagine while listening to the radio in a dark room, they wanted to walk into it, stand under it, touch its railings, ride its moving walkways, look at its lights, and come home able to say that the future still existed because they had been there and seen a little model of it. That is why the World's Fairs of the Depression years matter so much. They were not only entertainments, they were public arguments. They argued that progress had not ended. They argued that science, industry, design, electricity, transportation, medicine, plastics, chemicals, and machines could still carry the country somewhere better. They argued this at the very moment when millions of Americans had good reasons to doubt it. If a factory had closed in your town, the word industry did not sound like salvation. If a bank had swallowed your savings, the word progress might sound like a bad joke. If your farm had failed, if your father had no work, if your shoes were wearing through, if the country seemed unable to keep its promises, then a fairground full of shining buildings and confident slogans had a difficult job. It had to persuade tired people to look forward, and somehow many of them did. Let us begin in Chicago in 1933, because the timing almost feels impossible. the city opened a Century of Progress International Exposition in the middle of the Depression, when unemployment was still severe, banks had been failing, and the country was only beginning to feel the first effects of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Chicago itself was no stranger to hardship. It had known industrial power, immigrant labour, wealth, corruption, violence, stockyards, railroads, skyscrapers, and smoke. It was a city built on work, and by 1933 work itself had become uncertain for millions. And yet, along the lakefront, a fair opened that promised progress through science. Think about that phrase, progress through science. It sounds clean, almost too clean, when set against the actual lives of people trying to survive the Depression. But to many fairgoers, science meant something practical and visible. It meant new materials, better homes, faster trains, improved medicine, electric appliances, agricultural experiments, streamlined design. It meant that the future might not simply be a continuation of the present. The fair did not ask people to trust abstract optimism. It gave them exhibits, buildings, colours, lights, demonstrations and machines. It staged hope as something physical. The buildings at Chicago's fair did not look backward in the way many earlier fairs had done. The Great Columbian Exposition of 1893, also in Chicago, had been famous for its white city, with classical facades, symmetry, and a grand vision of civic beauty inspired by Europe and antiquity. The 1933 fair felt different. It used bright colours, modern forms, experimental materials, and lighting effects. Instead of pretending the future would arrive wearing marble columns, it suggested that the future might be angular, illuminated, engineered, and new. The fairgrounds at night became especially important. Electric light made the place glow in ways that ordinary streets and homes could not. Visitors walked under artificial brightness beside Lake Michigan and saw buildings washed in colour. For a country that had spent years watching storefronts go dark, that glow carried its own meaning. Now imagine arriving there as an ordinary visitor. Maybe you have saved for the trip. Maybe you live close enough to come for a day. Maybe your family could not afford it, but you've come with relatives, church members, friends, or a school group. The city itself is busy, and the fair pulls you toward the lake like a current. You hear voices, footsteps, vendors, engines, music, announcements, laughter, and the constant hum that large crowds produce when everyone is trying to look at everything at once. The scale is part of the experience. The Depression made many lives feel smaller. Smaller meals, smaller plans, smaller homes, smaller expectations. The fair did the opposite. It made the world feel huge again. At exhibits, visitors saw corporations and scientific institutions presenting the promise of modern life. There were displays about transportation, agriculture, home appliances, medicine, manufacturing and communication. Some exhibits were educational in the plain sense. Others were advertisements dressed as education. This is important to say clearly. World's fairs were not neutral visions of the future. They were heavily shaped by business, government, industry, and public relations. They showed the future that corporations wanted Americans to desire. A modern kitchen meant buying modern equipment. A modern road meant buying cars. A modern home meant new materials, new utilities, new products, new forms of consumption. Hope and marketing walked hand in hand through the fairgrounds. But again, the fact that something was commercial does not mean people experienced it as empty. A woman who had spent years managing a household with too little could look at a model kitchen and feel both longing and practical curiosity. A man who had lost work in an old industry could look at new machinery with complicated feelings, perhaps admiration, perhaps anxiety, perhaps resentment, perhaps the hope that somewhere in all that invention there might be jobs again. A child could look at a futuristic train or an electrical display and feel something simpler: wonder. Wonder was useful during the Depression. Wonder gave the mind a form of motion that was not worry. It made people ask what might happen next instead of only what might go wrong next. At Chicago, as in later fairs, visitors were invited to imagine a nation still capable of building, not merely surviving, building. The fair returned in 1934 because it had succeeded well enough to continue, and millions came across its 2 seasons. That continuation itself mattered. A fair is temporary by nature, but while it lasts, it creates a city of promise inside the real city. People could visit more than once. Newspapers could cover it. Children could hear about it from classmates. Souvenirs could be kept. Postcards could be sent. The fair extended beyond its gates into conversation, memory, and objects small enough to carry home. A ticket stub, a brochure, a photograph, a cheap souvenir. All of these became evidence. I was there. I saw it. There was something bright. Other expositions followed across the decade, each with its own local meaning. San Diego hosted the California Pacific International Exposition in 1935 and 1936, using Balboa Park's older exposition buildings and adding to the city's identity as a place of climate, beauty, tourism, and regional pride. Dallas held the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936, celebrating 100 years since Texas' independence, with a mix of history, spectacle, architecture, and state ambition. San Francisco would host the Golden Gate International Exposition in 1939 and 1940 on Treasure Island, celebrating bridges, Pacific connections, and a western-facing future. These events were not all the same, but they shared a Depression-era hunger for display. Cities and states wanted to show that they were not defeated. They wanted visitors, money, attention, and proof of vitality. The 1939 New York World's Fair brought this promise of tomorrow to its most famous form. Its theme was the world of tomorrow, and even the phrase tells you almost everything. By 1939, the Depression had not fully ended, and the world beyond America was growing more dangerous. War had already begun in Asia. Europe was moving toward catastrophe. Fascism had reshaped international politics. Yet in Queens, on a huge fairground built at Flushing Meadows, visitors entered a planned vision of the future under the symbols of the Trilon and Perisphere, a tall triangular spire and a great white sphere that looked unlike ordinary American architecture. They were not useful in a practical sense. They were icons, and icons do a different kind of work. They told visitors immediately that they had stepped into a place organised around tomorrow. Inside the Perisphere, fairgoer saw Democracity, a model city of the future, with planned suburbs, highways, green belts, orderly zones, and a vision of modern life that suggested technology and planning could solve the chaos of the present. The exhibit reflected ideas of design, urban planning, transportation, and social order, but it also reflected the assumptions of its time. It imagined a future that was controlled, clean, rational, and largely suburban. It did not dwell on poverty, segregation, labour conflict, or who might be left out of such planning. Like many futures, it was as revealing for what it omitted as for what it included. Still, imagine seeing it after years of depression, a miniature future laid out beneath theatrical lighting, roads that worked, houses in their places, industry organised, families moving easily, green space, clean lines, no bread lines in the model, no eviction notices, no dust storms, no men waiting outside a factory gate. The absence was the fantasy. The future, as displayed there, had been tidied. For a visitor exhausted by disorder, tidiness itself could feel like relief. The most famous exhibit of the 1939 fair was General Motors' Futurama, designed by Norman Bell Geddes. Visitors sat in moving chairs and travelled over an enormous model of America in 1960, complete with superhighways, streamlined cities, farms, suburbs, and traffic systems. It was a vision built by an automobile company, so naturally the future it imagined was a future of cars and roads. Wide highways swept across the landscape, traffic moved efficiently, the nation became something to be driven through. To modernise, knowing what highways would later do to cities, neighbourhoods, landscapes, and public life. The exhibit can feel both visionary and troubling, but to Depression visitors, many of whom had known stalled lives and bad roads and limited mobility, Futurama offered a thrilling promise. Movement would return, and it would be grand. Movement was one of the great dreams of the Depression. So many people had been forced to move unwillingly, in search of work, away from failed farms, out of homes they could not keep. Futurama offered movement without desperation. Roads not as exile, but as freedom. Travel not as displacement, but as mastery. The difference mattered. A family riding in an old car loaded with belongings because they had lost the farm experienced the road one way. A fair-goer looking down at a future highway system experienced it another way entirely. The road could mean loss or possibility depending on whether you chose it. The fair also included the Westinghouse exhibit, famous for Electro the Moto Man, a robot that could move, speak recorded phrases, count and smoke cigarettes as a crowd-pleasing trick. There was also a time capsule prepared by Westinghouse, meant to preserve objects and information for people thousands of years in the future. That idea is almost painfully optimistic when you think about 1939. Europe was on the edge of war, and within months Germany would invade Poland. Yet here was a company burying messages for the distant future, assuming not only that humanity would continue, but that future people would be curious about them. A time capsule is an act of confidence. It says we are worth remembering, and someone will be here to remember us. For an ordinary visitor, the robot may have been more immediate than the time capsule. A mechanical man standing before them, responding, performing, making the crowd laugh. It was part science, part theatre, part advertisement, part magic show. That mixture defined much of the fair. People did not always separate education from spectacle. They did not need to. A demonstration of a new material, a television broadcast, a streamlined train, a model city, a robot, a kitchen of the future, all of these belong to the same category of experience. Evidence that the world was still capable of surprise. Television itself appeared as a curiosity at the fair, still far from being a normal household presence. Visitors could see or hear about a technology that would later transform American evenings just as radio had done, but in 1939 it remained a promise more than a reality. That is another important point. The fairs often displayed futures unevenly. Some things shown would come true in altered form, some would fail. Some would arrive only for the wealthy at first, some would reshape life in ways the exhibitors did not predict. But the fair did not require perfect accuracy. It required believability in the moment. It had to make people feel that the line from the present to the future had not been cut. Now, not every American could attend these fairs. Travel cost money, admission cost money, food, lodging, souvenirs and transportation added more. Many families could only read about the fairs in newspapers or magazines, see photographs, watch newsreel footage, or hear relatives describe them. But even second-hand, the fairs spread images of tomorrow. A newspaper photograph of the Trilon and Perisphere could enter a home that would never send anyone to New York. A magazine article about Futurama could be read by someone who had never owned a new car. A newsreel could show crowds moving through exhibits to people sitting in theatres far away. Like all Depression escapes, the fair did not have to be physically accessible to everyone in order to shape imagination. There was also a simpler, more local version of the promise of tomorrow, and it lived along American roads. The 1930s were years of increasing automobile culture, even though the Depression limited travel for many. Roads had been improving for decades, and federal and state projects, including New Deal work, contributed to highways, bridges, parks, and infrastructure. Families who owned cars sometimes took modest trips when they could, not grand vacations perhaps, but drives to relatives, lakes, state parks, fairgrounds, tourist cabins, roadside stands, and odd attractions advertised by signs long before arrival. Roadside America became one of the strangest and most revealing escape landscapes of the era. If the World's Fair offered an organised future, the roadside attraction offered surprise. A giant animal statue, a cave tour, a reptile farm, a mystery spot, a scenic overlook, a souvenir stand shaped like a teapot, a coffee pot, a shoe, a castle, a windmill, a fruit, or anything large enough to make a driver slow down. The architecture of the roadside did not always aim for good taste. It aimed for attention. In a world before interstate highways standardized so much of travel, the road was full of local attempts to catch the eye. These places mattered because they made ordinary travel feel adventurous. A family that could not afford an ocean cruise or a hotel resort might still pack sandwiches, borrow or fill the car with gasoline, and drive out on a Sunday. They could visit a state park built or improved by New Deal labour. They could stop at a roadside stand for a cold drink. They could take a photograph beside an oversized object. They could buy one postcard. They could say they had gone somewhere. During a decade when many people were trapped by money, even a short trip could feel like a victory over confinement. The road also carried fantasy westward. Route 66, established in the 1920s, became famous in the Depression partly because of migration, especially as Dust Bowl families travelled toward California. For those migrants, the road was not a carefree escape. It was necessity and often misery. John Steinbeck would later help fix that image in American memory. But the same highways that carried desperation also carried tourists, salesmen, dreamers, hitchhikers, performers, and families seeking brief recreation. Roads are complicated that way. They do not tell you whether a traveller is running towards something or away from something. Sometimes even the traveller is not sure. Roadside advertising turned the landscape into a sequence of promises. Signs painted on barns, boards, rocks and fences told motorists to see caves, visit gardens, buy gasoline, drink soda, stay at clean tourist cabins, eat hot meals, or detour toward wonders just ahead. The famous Sea Rock City barn advertisements began in the 1930s, spreading the name of a tourist attraction near Chattanooga across rural roads and barns. A barn roof became an invitation. A driver might pass dozens of such signs before ever seeing the place itself. The attraction began in the imagination long before arrival. That is how escape often works. The promise starts doing its work before the experience begins. Tourist courts and cabins also became part of this landscape. Before the modern motel became standardized, travellers might stay in small roadside cabins, motor courts, or camps designed for automobile tourists. Some were clean and comfortable, some were rough. For families with limited money, they offered cheaper lodging than downtown hotels and the feeling of independence that came with parking near one's own door. The automobile changed the psychology of travel. You could carry food, blankets, children, tools, luggage, and hope in the same machine. Even an old car could feel like private territory moving through public space. State parks and national parks provided another kind of escape, one tied less to commercial spectacle and more to landscape. The Civilian Conservation Corps, created in 1933, employed young men in conservation work, building trails, lodges, roads, bridges, fire towers, campsites and park facilities across the country. Their work reshaped public access to nature. A family visiting a park in the later 1930s might picnic at a table built by CCC workers, hike a trail they cleared, or cross a bridge they constructed. The park visit was leisure, but it was also connected to relief, employment, and public investment. The New Deal, in this sense, helped build some of the very places where Americans could escape the strain of the era. Nature offered a different promise than technology. The fairs said tomorrow would be modern. The park said the country still had beauty older than the crisis. Both messages mattered. A city family standing by a lake or under tall trees could feel the mind loosen. A young man in the CCC could send money home and also experience, perhaps for the first time, mountains, forests, discipline, regular meals and wages. For him, escape and work were not separate. The camp itself was part of the rescue. County fairs, carnivals, and local expositions continued too, often on a smaller scale. They offered rides, livestock displays, competitions, food stands, sideshows, music, games, and the familiar pleasure of crowds. For rural communities especially, a fair could affirm that local life still had rhythms despite hard times. A prize pumpkin, a canned goods ribbon, a livestock judging, a pie contest, a Ferris wheel, a child sticky with candy. All of it said that the year had not been only failure. Even modest public celebration could push back against despair. We should also remember that not everyone experienced these promises equally. Segregation shaped travel brutally. Black motorists in the 1930s faced danger, discrimination, and humiliation on the road, including refusal of service at hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and tourist sites. The Negro Motorist Green Book would first appear in 1936 to help black travellers find safe lodging and businesses. That fact changes the meaning of roadside escape. For white families, the road might promise freedom and spontaneity. For black families, travel required planning for safety in a country where a wrong stop could become dangerous. World's fairs and public attractions could also segregate, exclude, or demean. The future being advertised was often not equally offered. And still, black Americans travelled, attended fairs, built leisure cultures, visited resorts and beaches where they could, supported black-owned businesses, and created their own maps of possibility. The desire to escape, rest, see, and enjoy did not belong only to those whom the dominant culture welcomed. If anything, the need could be sharper for people carrying both economic hardship and racial oppression. A safe vacation spot, a welcoming roadside inn, a fair day with family, a church excursion. These were not minor pleasures. They were acts of claiming life. The promise of tomorrow also had a political edge. The Depression had damaged faith in old systems. World's fairs and modern exhibits tried to rebuild faith not necessarily in Wall Street, but in organised progress. Corporations used them to regain public trust. Governments used them to display stability and ambition. Cities used them to attract attention. Visitors used them for pleasure. All these uses overlapped. A fairground could be propaganda, advertisement, playground, classroom, theatre, and dream at the same time. There is a scene I find useful here. A father and daughter at the New York World's Fair in 1939. He has found enough work that year to make the trip possible, but not enough to stop worrying. She is young, old enough to remember lights and shapes, too young to understand fully what the Depression has done to her parents. They stand before the Trilon and Perisphere. The crowd moves around them. He is tired from walking. She's asking questions faster than he can answer. What is inside the sphere? How tall is the tower? Can people live in the city of tomorrow? Will cars really drive on roads like that? He does not know. No one really knows. But for once, not knowing feels pleasant. Not knowing means possibility instead of dread. Later they pass exhibits of appliances they cannot afford, cars they will not buy, kitchens cleaner than their own, machines that seem designed for another class of person. This could hurt. It probably does hurt a little. The fair promises a future, but does not hand it equally to everyone at the gate. Yet the daughter sees shapes, lights, movement. She sees adults looking up instead of down. She sees her father explain something with interest in his voice. That memory may outlast the discomfort. Years later, she may not remember what they could not afford. She may remember that for one day, tomorrow had buildings. This is what the fairs and roadside wonders offered at their best. They gave Americans rehearsals of hope. Not guarantees, not solutions. Rehearsals. You walked through a model city before any such city existed. You rode past a model highway before such highways covered the country. You stood beside an oversized roadside attraction and laughed because absurdity had interrupted worry. You visited a park and saw public work made visible in stone, wood, and trail. You drove 20 miles and called it a trip. You bought a postcard and sent proof that the world was larger than the room where bills waited. The danger, of course, was that tomorrow could become another product. Buy this car, this appliance, this fuel, this road, this house, this vision, and the future will arrive. The Depression had already shown that buying could not save everyone. Yet consumption remained woven into American hope. The world's fairs did not imagine a future of having less. They imagined better things, newer things, smoother things, cleaner things, faster things. For people who had been forced into scarcity, that abundance could be intoxicating. It could also be misleading. But it was understandable. After years of patching, saving, repairing, and doing without, the sight of anything new had emotional force. As the decade approached its end, the promise of tomorrow grew more complicated. The 1939 New York World's Fair opened with optimism, but the world darkened quickly. War in Europe began that September. The future would not arrive only as streamlined cars and model suburbs. It would arrive as mobilization, factories, uniforms, rationing, weapons, loss, and a transformation of American life on a scale few fairgoers could have fully imagined. Some of the technologies celebrated in peaceful exhibits would soon be redirected toward war. The world of tomorrow was real, but not as innocent as the brochure suggested. Still, we should not mock the people who believed even briefly in the cleaner version. They had lived through years when the present gave them little reason to be generous. To stand at a fair and look forward was itself a kind of courage. Cynicism is easy when promises fail. Hope requires more risk. The fairgoer looking at Futurama, the child staring at a robot, the family stopping at a roadside wonder, the young couple driving to a state park with sandwiches wrapped in paper. They were not fools. They were doing what people do when they need the future to remain imaginable. Night falls over the fairgrounds. The lights come on, and once again the Depression has to compete with brightness. The Trilon and Perisphere glow against the dark. In Chicago, coloured lights wash over modern buildings near the lake. At a county fair, bulbs swing above a midway. Along a highway, a sign promises cabins, cold drinks, or some wonder just ahead. A family climbs back into a car with tired children and a souvenir folded in someone's lap. The road home is darker than the fair, and the house waiting at the end of it is still the same house. But they have seen something. A model city, a machine, a bridge, a new road, a public park, a shape of tomorrow. And in a decade when reality had narrowed so many lives, seeing tomorrow was another way of escaping today. Not by denying the Depression, but by insisting that the Depression was not the only possible version of America. There were still roads to build, games to hear, stories to read, songs to sing, heroes to follow, fairs to visit, and lights that came on after sunset. All of these escapes were temporary. Every one of them ended. The movie ended, the radio signed off, the dance stopped, the magazine closed, the game was over, the fair gates shut. But the need they answered did not vanish, and neither did the strength people drew from them. To understand why these small departures from reality mattered so much, we have to look at what they gave back to people who had lost more than money. By the time the 1930s were nearing their end, Americans had learned how to live two lives at once. There was the life everyone could see in daylight, the life of work if you had it, searching if you did not, stretching meals, answering questions from children, patching clothes, waiting for checks, watching crops fail, reading headlines, listening for rumours, and trying to keep your face steady in front of people who were trying to keep their own faces steady too. And then there was the other life, the one that opened in pieces. A movie screen, a radio programme, a baseball game, a dance floor, a comic strip, a fairground glowing after sunset, a board game on the table, a song coming through static. None of these things erased the first life. They did not have that kind of power, but they made it possible to return to it. That is the part that is easiest to misunderstand. Escapism often gets treated as weakness, as if turning away from reality for an hour means a person does not have the courage to face it. But the Americans who lived through the Great Depression were not short on courage. They faced reality every morning whether they wanted to or not. A mother who had to feed children with too little food was not avoiding reality. A farmer watching dust move across land he could no longer trust was not avoiding reality. A man walking from one workplace to another asking for a job that did not exist was not avoiding reality. These people had reality in abundance. What they lacked was relief. Relief is not the same as denial. Relief is what lets a person continue after strain has lasted too long. A chair is relief for tired legs. Sleep is relief for a tired body. Laughter, story, music, play, and spectacle are relief for a mind that has been required to carry too much. During the Depression, entertainment became one of the ways ordinary Americans protected the parts of themselves that economic disaster could not be allowed to consume: their pride, their humour, their imagination. Their ability to sit with other people, their sense that tomorrow might contain something other than repetition. Think back to the movie Palace. A person did not walk out of a theatre with a job in hand because Fred Astaire danced across a polished floor, or because a gangster fell in the final reel. But they might walk out less numb than when they entered. They might have laughed in a crowd. They might have seen beauty. They might have borrowed confidence from someone on the screen who moved as if the world still had rhythm. That matters. Hardship can make the world feel flat. The movies restored depth, colour, motion, glamour, danger, romance, and scale. They reminded people that life had registers other than worry. The radio did something quieter but just as important. It entered homes and gave families shared attention. During the Depression, the household could become a tense place because home was where failure showed itself most clearly. The unpaid rent notice came home. The empty pay envelope failed to come home. The thin supper was eaten at home. The children asked questions at home. A radio program gave the family a reason to gather without forcing them to speak directly about everything they feared. A comedy could let a father laugh without explaining why he had been silent all day. A serial could accompany a mother through work no one noticed. A president's voice could turn panic into sentences. A baseball broadcast could restore expertise to a man who had lost his workplace identity. In those rooms, listening together became a kind of household repair. The games did a different kind of work. Cards, puzzles, bingo, Monopoly, street games, amateur nights, and dance contests created little worlds with rules. The larger economy had broken faith with people. It had told them effort would lead to security, then taken security away from the careful and careless alike. A game could not fix that betrayal, but it could create a temporary system where action had visible consequence. Roll dice, draw a card, complete a puzzle, call bingo, stay on your feet another hour. Win, lose, try again. The stakes were often small, but the emotional structure was large. People needed situations where choices still seemed to matter. Even the harshest entertainments of the decade, like dance marathons, reveal this need. They were exploitative, and many observers at the time knew it. They turned exhaustion into a spectacle, and desperation into admission sales. But they also show how badly people wanted struggle to have form. In real life, endurance could be invisible. A woman might endure years of household strain and receive no applause. A man might endure months of unemployment and be seen only as idle. A family might endure hunger privately. In a marathon hall, endurance was public, counted, announced, watched. That did not make it kind, but it made it legible. A country full of tired people paid to watch tiredness become a contest because at least in the contest someone could win. Cheap reading gave Americans something just as valuable: forward motion. A pulp story had a next page, a comic strip had a next panel, a serial had a next installment. During the Depression, real life often felt stalled, suspended between bad news and more bad news. Print pulled the reader forward, the detective followed the clue, the cowboy rode toward the ridge, the orphan girl survived the adults. The superhero, when he arrived near the end of the decade, acted with impossible speed against problems that in real life moved through courts, banks, offices and systems too slowly for human pain. These stories were not subtle, but subtlety is not always what a person in trouble needs. Sometimes a tired reader needs someone to open the door, confront the villain and do something. Sports gave Americans public proof of effort under pressure. That proof was imperfect because American sports were shaped by the same inequalities as the rest of the country. Black athletes faced segregation. Women athletes faced ridicule and limited opportunities. Poor fighters were exploited. Owners and promoters profited. And yet the field and ring still produced moments that people could believe in. Lou Gehrig showing up day after day. Joe Louis standing in the ring before a nation that did not treat him equally and still carrying its hopes. Negro League players creating excellence in a system that tried to keep them outside official recognition. A boxer getting up. A hitter breaking a slump. A horse considered too small, outrunning expectation. Sports did not make America fair, but it gave Americans visible acts of courage. And sometimes that was enough to keep courage in circulation. The fairs and roadside wonders gave a different gift. They made the future visible. This was not a small thing in a decade when the present had become so demanding. At Chicago's Century of Progress, at the New York World's Fair, at state fairs, county fairs, parks, roadside attractions and tourist stops, Americans saw machines, lights, buildings, model cities, highways and public spaces that suggested the country had not reached its end. Much of that promise was commercial. Corporations used the future to sell products. Cities used fairs to sell themselves. The future on display often left out poverty, racial injustice, labour conflict, and the people who would not be invited equally into the shining world being advertised. Still, visitors could stand there and look forward. After years of looking down at bills, looking back at what had been lost, or looking around for work, looking forward itself was a form of recovery. What all these escapes had in common was not that they made people forget completely. They rarely did. Instead, they changed the size of reality for a while. The Depression made reality feel narrow. It narrowed diets, wardrobes, homes, plans, courtships, childhoods, travel, ambitions, and confidence. Entertainment widened the frame. A person could be poor and still sit beneath a painted theatre ceiling. A family could be worried and still laugh at the same radio joke. A child could have patched clothes and still imagine a rocket ship. A black community facing segregation could still gather to celebrate Joe Louis or cheer Negro League brilliance. A farm family could still listen to distant music after a day of dust. A young couple could still dance. The widening did not solve the narrowness, but it kept people from mistaking the narrowness for the whole world. There was also community in these escapes, and community was one of the things the Depression threatened most. Poverty isolates people. Shame keeps people indoors. Unemployment can cut a person away from the workplace, from routine, from friends, from the daily proof of usefulness. Foreclosure can scatter neighbours. Migration can break families across distance. Entertainment pulled people back together. Movie audiences laughed in the same dark. Radio listeners gathered in living rooms. Card players sat around tables. Sports fans argued in barbershops. Fairgoers moved in crowds. Children traded comics and played games in streets. Even when the pleasure was small, it created contact. It reminded people that they were not suffering alone. that shared quality mattered because the Depression was not only an economic event, it was an emotional event. It damaged confidence, identity, and trust. Many Americans had been raised to believe that hard work and self-discipline would protect them. The Depression proved that this was not always true. That discovery could be devastating. If a person did everything right and still lost everything, then what did effort mean? Entertainment could not answer that question fully, but it could offer partial answers. Effort might not always save a farm, but it could win a game. Discipline might not reopen a factory, but it could make an athlete great. Luck might be cruel in life, but around a board game it could be laughed at. A story might not be true, but it could be orderly. These partial answers helped people endure the absence of complete ones. The New Deal understood some of this, even when it was focused on jobs, infrastructure, relief and reform. The federal government did not only build roads, bridges, dams, schools and parks. Through programs like the Works Progress Administration, it also supported writers, actors, musicians, artists and theatre workers. The Federal Theatre Project staged performances. The Federal Writers Project employed writers and collected stories, guidebooks, histories and interviews. The Federal Art Project produced murals, posters and public art. These projects were not merely decorative. They recognised that a society in crisis needs more than bread, though it certainly needs bread first. It also needs meaning, memory, beauty, instruction and public imagination. People need to see themselves as citizens of a country still being made, not simply victims of a country that failed. This is not to romanticise the Depression. There was nothing charming about hunger. There was nothing noble about children going without medical care, or families losing farms, or men feeling worthless because no one would hire them. There was nothing quaint about racial discrimination in relief programs, segregated public life, migrant hardship, or the many people who fell through the cracks of every system meant to help them. We should be careful whenever we speak warmly about the culture of a hard time. The warmth was often created because the cold was real. But that is exactly why the warmth matters. The songs, films, games, comics, sports and fairs were not proof that the Depression was easier than we think. They are proof that people were more resourceful than statistics can show. Unemployment rates tell us how many people lacked work. Bank failure numbers tell us how many institutions collapsed. Crop reports tell us what the land produced or failed to produce. Those numbers are necessary, but they do not tell us how a family got through Tuesday night. For that, we need the radio in the corner, the movie ticket, the deck of cards, the Sunday comics, the ball game, the dance, the fair brochure saved in a drawer. Imagine one last evening, not one family now but many, spread across the country. In New York, a theatre empties and people step back into the street humming a song from the film. In Ohio, a family turns off the radio after a comedy, and the youngest child repeats the best line incorrectly, which makes everyone laugh again. In Kansas, a woman folds a newspaper and saves the comic section for morning because the children will want it. In Chicago, a man studies the sports page and rereads the account of a fight, even though he already knows the result. In Georgia, neighbours finish a card game and linger at the door because going home means returning to their own worries. In Harlem, men in a barbershop talk about Joe Louis with pride that does not need to be softened. In California, a migrant child listens to adults talk outside a camp and draws shapes in the dirt from a comic strip remembered imperfectly. In Queens, a visitor to the World's Fair carries home a souvenir of the world of tomorrow, to a room that still belongs very much to today. None of them has escaped forever. That was never possible. The movie ends, the radio signs off, the cards are gathered, the newspaper is folded, the stadium empties, the fair closes. Morning comes. And with morning comes the same work of survival. Finding wages, making food, answering children, repairing clothes, facing weather, facing bosses, facing offices, facing silence. But the person who returns to hardship after relief is not exactly the same as the person who had no relief at all. They may have one joke in reserve, one song, one image of a bright city, one hero's victory, one story unfinished and waiting, one memory of sitting with others and feeling the room lift. That is why escaping reality helped Americans survive the Great Depression. It did not replace courage, it restored it in small amounts. It did not erase fear, it gave fear competition. It did not deny hardship, it made room beside hardship for laughter, rhythm, suspense, beauty, skill, wonder and hope. Those things can sound soft until you see what happens to people when they disappear. A society cannot live on entertainment alone, but neither can it live on bread alone if every evening is only dread. The Americans of the 1930s were not naive because they loved movies, radio, games, sports, comics, and fairs. They were human. They understood, perhaps without needing to say it, that survival is not only the act of remaining alive, it is the act of remaining able to feel, to imagine, to gather, to laugh, to admire, to look forward, and to believe that the present moment, however hard, is not the full measure of life. So when we picture them now, let us not see only the breadline, though the breadline was real. Let us not see only the dust storm, though the dust storm was real. Let us not see only the closed bank, the lost farm, the factory gate, the worn shoe, the watered soup, though all of those were real too. Let us also see the glow on their faces in the movie dark. The child on the floor with the funny pages, the father leaning toward the radio, the mother laughing while still mending, the young couple dancing because youth had not agreed to disappear, the crowd holding its breath at a fight, the fairgoer looking up at a white sphere and trying to imagine 1960, the family around a board game pretending for an hour that they owned railroads and hotels and whole avenues. Those moments were temporary, fragile, and sometimes commercialized, but they were not meaningless. They were the small shelters people built inside the storm. And when the decade finally gave way to another crisis, when Depression America moved into wartime America, many of those habits of shared attention, shared sacrifice, shared stories, and shared hope would carry forward. The people who had learned to gather around radios would gather for war news. The factories that had stood silent would roar again. The highways imagined in fair exhibits would begin to take more permanent shape. The children who read superheroes would grow into a world that needed real rescue and asked far too much of them. For tonight, though, we can leave them in that earlier darkness, not saved yet, not comfortable, not free from fear, but not defeated either. Somewhere a radio tube is cooling after the last programme. Somewhere a theatre marquee is still bright over a nearly empty street. Somewhere a pulp magazine lies open beside a bed. Somewhere dice are being returned to a box. Somewhere a sports page is folded carefully and placed on a chair for morning. The depression is still outside the door, but inside for a little while there has been light.